Hey everyone, and welcome back to another night of unbelievable Reddit stories while we build something peaceful in Minecraft. Tonight we're starting with a story that will make your jaw drop. The audacity is breathtaking when someone you trust turns your personal space into their side business headquarters. Now, a quick shout out to all of you who keep watching, commenting, and showing love to the channel. Seriously, you're awesome, and I couldn't do this without you. I hired Maria 3 months ago after she came with absolutely glowing references from two different families in my neighborhood. The woman seemed like a godsend, honestly. She was punctual, thorough, and my place had never looked better. She even had this sweet grandmotherly vibe that made me feel comfortable leaving her alone in my apartment while I was at work. Her rates were reasonable, she brought her own supplies, and she always left little notes telling me what she'd accomplished that day. It felt like I'd finally found that unicorn of domestic help that everyone talks about, but nobody actually seems to have. But about 6 weeks into our arrangement, I started noticing some weird little things that didn't quite add up. My sheets always felt different on cleaning days, like they'd been washed in a different detergent or something. There was this faint smell I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant exactly, but definitely not my usual fabric softener. At first, I thought maybe Maria was just being extra thorough, maybe using some professional grade cleaning products I wasn't familiar with. I actually appreciated what I thought was her attention to detail. Then my security camera started acting up, but only on Tuesdays when Maria came to clean. I'd installed a basic camera in my living room after my neighbor's place got broken into. Nothing fancy, just one of those Wi-Fi ones that sends alerts to your phone. Every other day it worked perfectly, but on cleaning days, dead. No signal, no recording, nothing. Maria always had an explanation ready when I mentioned it. The Wi-Fi must have gone out, or maybe she accidentally unplugged something while vacuuming. Or perhaps the cleaning spray was interfering with the electronics somehow. Her explanations were always plausible enough that I didn't push it. I mean, what was I supposed to think? That my sweet 60-something cleaning lady was deliberately sabotaging my security system? It seemed paranoid even to consider it. You almost have to admire the audacity of having a backup excuse ready every single time. The smell thing kept bothering me though. It wasn't just the sheets, I started noticing it in my bedroom generally. It was masculine, like cologne or aftershave, but not overpowering. Just this lingering scent that definitely wasn't mine and definitely wasn't anything Maria would be wearing. I asked her about it once, wondering if maybe her husband had been helping her move furniture or something, but she looked genuinely confused and said she always worked alone. She even seemed a little offended that I'd suggest she bring someone else into my home without permission. That's when I decided to install a backup camera, just a tiny one hidden in my bedroom that connected to a different network. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but something in my gut was screaming that things weren't adding up. The weird smells, the camera malfunctions, the way my bedroom always felt slightly different after cleaning days, like the energy in the room had shifted somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been in my space. Installing that hidden camera felt like such a violation of trust, and I actually felt guilty about it for days. Maria had never given me any real reason to doubt her beyond these weird little inconsistencies that could all be explained away. But I couldn't ignore my instincts anymore, especially when I realized that my expensive silk pillowcases had somehow gotten tiny tears in them that definitely hadn't been there before. But that wasn't even the worst part. The footage from my hidden camera was absolutely mind-blowing. The first recording showed Maria arriving right on schedule with her cleaning supplies, but about an hour into what should have been her routine, she answered my front door and let in a middle-aged man I'd never seen before. They talked quietly for a few minutes, and then she led him straight to my bedroom. I watched in complete disbelief as they both got comfortable on my bed, and it became very clear very quickly that cleaning was not on the agenda. I fast-forwarded through the rest of that day's footage with my mouth hanging open. They spent nearly 2 hours in my bedroom doing exactly what you'd expect, and then the guy left an envelope on my nightstand before Maria walked him out. She pocketed the money, stripped my bed completely, threw everything in the wash, and then spent the rest of her scheduled time actually cleaning the apartment. She even left one of her usual cheerful notes about how she'd given the bedroom extra attention that day. The next week's footage showed a completely different man. Same routine. The week after that, another stranger. I started going back through my phone's motion alerts and realized this had been happening for at least a month, maybe longer, every single Tuesday. Like clockwork. Things went from bad to unhinged when I decided to do some internet detective work. I reverse searched my address online and found it listed on 3 different escort service websites as a discreet upscale location available Tuesdays. The listings didn't mention Maria by name, but they described the exact layout of my apartment and even mentioned specific details like my marble bathroom counters and the city view from my bedroom windows. One of the ads literally said "Experience luxury in a beautiful private residence" and was charging premium rates for what it called an authentic high-end experience. She had been running a full-scale operation out of my home, using my bed, my sheets, my shower, everything. According to the timestamps on these listings, she'd been advertising my place since about 2 weeks after I hired her. The woman had basically turned my apartment into her personal business headquarters, and I was unknowingly providing the venue. I felt sick reading through the details. She was charging these guys extra for the exclusive private residence experience and pocketing every penny while I paid her to clean my house. The reviews were even worse. Clients were commenting on how comfortable my bed was, how nice my shower pressure was, how the hostess always made sure everything was perfectly clean and private. At this point, I'm thinking this feels like a deleted scene from some twisted reality show. But here's where everything finally came crashing down. I decided to come home early from work the following Tuesday, about 2 hours into Maria's usual cleaning time. I wanted to catch her in the act and confront her with all the evidence I'd gathered. I figured I'd walk in, catch her cleaning like normal, and then present her with everything I'd discovered. Instead, I walked into my apartment and heard voices coming from my bedroom. My blood pressure shot through the roof as I crept toward my own bedroom door and peeked inside. There was Maria in my bed, with yet another stranger. They were both half-dressed and clearly in the middle of business hours. I stood there for about 10 seconds trying to process what I was seeing, and then I just walked right in and said, "What the hell is going on in my bedroom?" The guy practically jumped out of his skin and started scrambling for his clothes, clearly mortified. Maria, on the other hand, had the nerve to look annoyed that I'd interrupted them. Her excuse was absolutely unbelievable. She tried to tell me that this gentleman was feeling unwell and just needed to lie down for a few minutes, and she was simply keeping him company to make sure he was okay, while they were both half naked, in my bed, with an envelope of cash sitting on my nightstand. When I pointed out that they were obviously not just resting, she doubled down and said they were both adults, and it wasn't my business what they did during her break time. Her break time, in my bed, that I was paying her to clean. The guy was frantically getting dressed and mumbling apologies, clearly wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. I felt bad for him, honestly, because he obviously had no idea he'd been paying to use some random person's bedroom without their knowledge. Maria had probably told all her clients that this was her place, or that she had permission or something. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, because this nightmare is far from over. When the guy finally escaped, Maria tried to flip the script and make me the bad guy for violating her privacy and embarrassing her client. She actually had the audacity to suggest that I should have called before coming home to my own apartment. She said I was being unreasonable and that what she did on her breaks was her own business. I told her I knew about the websites, the advertisements, the multiple clients, everything. I showed her screenshots of the listings featuring my address and the reviews mentioning details about my apartment. Her whole attitude changed when she realized how much evidence I had. She went from indignant to defensive to basically begging me not to call the police. She tried to negotiate, offering to cut me in on the profits since I was technically providing the venue. She said we could be partners and split the money 50-50. When that didn't work, she offered to pay me rent for using my bedroom on Tuesdays. When I told her she was completely insane, she started crying and saying she needed the money to support her grandchildren, and this was the only way she could make ends meet. I fired her on the spot, obviously. I told her she had exactly 10 minutes to get all her stuff and get out of my apartment, and that if I ever saw her near my building again, I'd call the police immediately. She kept trying to argue that I couldn't prove anything, and that it would be my word against hers, but I reminded her about the hidden camera footage and the websites using my address. The aftermath was honestly almost as bad as the discovery itself. I had to get tested for every STD imaginable because who knows what had been happening in my bed for months. I threw out my mattress, all my bedding, even my pillows. I couldn't stand the thought of sleeping on anything she'd contaminated with her side business. Between the new mattress, the testing, the deep cleaning service I hired to sanitize everything, and replacing all my bedding, the whole ordeal cost me over $800. I tried to report her to the police, but they said since she hadn't technically stolen any physical property, and since I'd given her permission to be in my apartment, there wasn't much they could do. The websites had already taken down the listings by the time the cops looked into it, probably because Maria warned them somehow. The officers suggested I could try to pursue it as fraud or maybe sue her in civil court, but they made it clear that criminal charges would be difficult to make stick. I did manage to track down the families who'd given her those glowing references, and it turns out she'd been running the same scam at their places too. One of them had noticed similar weird signs, but hadn't put it together until I called. The other family was completely shocked, but said it explained why their security cameras kept mysteriously malfunctioning on cleaning days. They basically wrote their own ending without realizing it, leaving a digital trail that led right back to them. I never did figure out how many clients she'd brought through my apartment or how much money she'd made using my space as her personal business headquarters. Part of me doesn't want to know. What I do know is that I'll never trust another cleaning service again without doing a full background check and keeping cameras running the entire time they're in my home. The worst part is that she was actually a really good cleaner when she wasn't running her escort service out of my bedroom. My apartment was always spotless, she was reliable, and if she'd just stuck to actually cleaning, I would have recommended her to everyone I knew. Instead, she turned my home into a personal brothel and probably would have kept doing it indefinitely if I hadn't gotten suspicious about those camera malfunctions. But speaking of people crossing boundaries in shared living spaces, wait until you hear what happened when someone discovered their roommate's very personal secret. Living with Sarah seemed like the perfect roommate situation when we first moved in together 6 months ago. We'd connected through a mutual friend, both of us needed someone to split rent with, and she seemed responsible and clean. She worked different hours than me, which meant we weren't constantly on top of each other, and she was always respectful about shared spaces and keeping common areas tidy. For the first few months, everything was honestly great. We'd hang out occasionally, watch movies together, and it felt like I'd lucked out with a roommate who was actually becoming a friend. But sometime around month 3, I started noticing these tiny little things that made me feel like I was losing my mind. Items in my bedroom would be in slightly different spots than where I'd left them. Nothing major, just small shifts that caught my eye. My jewelry box would be angled differently on my dresser, or my books would be in a slightly different order on my nightstand. At first I thought I was just being paranoid, or maybe I'd moved things myself and forgotten about it. The weird thing was, it was never anything valuable that got moved. My laptop stayed put, my cash was always where I left it, my expensive jewelry was untouched. It was just these random personal items that would be repositioned by like an inch or two. I started to wonder if maybe Sarah was cleaning my room as a nice gesture and just not mentioning it. But when I asked her about it, she seemed genuinely confused and said she never went in my room except to borrow something with permission. Then I started noticing something that made my stomach drop. My vibrator, which I kept in a specific drawer in a specific position, was definitely being moved. Not just repositioned, but like someone had taken it out, used it, and then tried to put it back exactly where they found it. The problem was, they weren't quite getting the placement right. I'm pretty particular about my personal space, and I definitely remembered exactly how I'd left it. At first I told myself I was being absolutely ridiculous. Who would do something like that? And why would anyone risk getting caught doing something so violating and weird? But the more I paid attention, the more certain I became that someone was definitely going through my most private belongings. The paranoia was eating at me. I started taking photos of my room before I left for work, just to document where everything was positioned. Sure enough, things were different when I got home. Not dramatically different, but enough that I could tell someone had been in there. My dresser drawers would be closed slightly differently. My closet door would be positioned at a different angle. And yes, my personal items were definitely being disturbed. I felt like I was going crazy, honestly. The idea that my roommate was sneaking into my room and using my most intimate belongings was so violating and bizarre that I couldn't wrap my head around it. But the evidence kept piling up, and I knew I had to figure out what was actually happening. Imagine being this careful about replacing everything and still getting caught because you can't nail the exact positioning. That's when I decided to set up a discreet camera in my bedroom. I got one of those tiny wireless ones that looks like a phone charger and positioned it where it would capture my dresser area. I felt weird about putting a camera in my own bedroom, but I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if something genuinely messed up was happening. The first few days of footage showed nothing unusual. Sarah would come home from work, stay in the common areas, and never enter my room. I started to think maybe I really was being paranoid and the whole thing was in my head. Maybe I was just stressed from work and imagining things that weren't there. But that wasn't even the worst part. On Thursday afternoon, while I was at work, the camera caught Sarah using her key to unlock my bedroom door. She stood in the doorway for a minute, looking around like she was making sure the coast was clear, and then walked straight to my dresser. I watched in complete disbelief as she opened the exact drawer where I kept my personal items and pulled out my most expensive vibrator, like she knew exactly where to find it. What happened next made me feel sick to my stomach. She actually tested it to make sure it was working, and then settled onto my bed and used it. The whole thing took about 20 minutes, and afterward she cleaned it meticulously in my bathroom sink, dried it carefully, and then placed it back in my drawer. She spent another few minutes repositioning other items in my room, clearly trying to make everything look exactly like she'd found it. The level of premeditation was what really got to me. This wasn't some impulsive moment of curiosity. She had obviously been doing this for a while and had developed a whole routine around it. She knew where everything was, she had a system for cleaning up afterward, and she was clearly being very careful about not getting caught. I sat there watching this footage with my mouth hanging open, feeling violated in a way I'd never experienced before. This was someone I trusted, someone I'd been sharing meals with and having friendly conversations with, and she'd been secretly using my most intimate belongings for months. The worst part was realizing how long this had probably been going on. All those times I'd noticed things being moved around, all those moments when I'd questioned my own memory and wondered if I was being paranoid, she'd been systematically violating my privacy and my personal space. And here's where it gets absurd. I kept watching the camera footage from other days, and it became clear that this was happening multiple times per week, Tuesdays and Thursdays when I worked late, sometimes on weekends when I was out running errands. She had basically memorized my schedule and was using my personal items whenever she knew I'd be gone for more than an hour. The footage also revealed that she wasn't just using my vibrator. She was going through my entire dresser, trying on my underwear, using my expensive skincare products, and even sleeping in my bed sometimes. I watched her take off her clothes, put on my lingerie, use my personal items, and then carefully wash and replace everything before leaving my room. She had turned my bedroom into her personal playground, and I'd been completely oblivious to the extent of it. The woman was basically living a double life, and my private space was her secret fantasy world. I felt like I needed a shower just watching the footage. The idea that she'd been wearing my underwear, using my bed, and touching my most personal belongings made me want to throw out everything I owned and start over. I couldn't even figure out what to be most angry about: the violation of my privacy, the use of my personal items, or the fact that she'd been lying to my face for months. This feels like something you'd read about happening to someone else, not something that would actually happen in your own home. When I confronted Sarah with the video evidence, I printed out screenshots and laid them on the kitchen table when she got home from work. I told her we needed to talk and showed her the photos of herself in my bedroom, using my belongings. Her face went completely white, and for a second I thought she might actually faint. Her first reaction was to deny everything, even with photographic evidence sitting right in front of her. She tried to claim the photos were fake, or that I'd somehow manipulated them. When that didn't work, she tried to minimize it by saying she'd only done it once or twice when she was really stressed and just needed to relax. But when I told her I had hours of footage showing a pattern going back weeks, she completely broke down. She started crying and admitted that she'd been doing it for months, almost since we'd moved in together. She said she was too embarrassed to buy her own personal items, and that mine was so much nicer than anything she could afford. The excuse was honestly more insulting than the behavior itself. She was making decent money at her job, definitely enough to afford her own personal items, but she'd chosen to violate my privacy instead of just going to a store like a normal adult. She said she'd been planning to stop, but kept finding excuses to do it just one more time. She also admitted to using my skincare products, wearing my underwear, and sleeping in my bed when I was out of town. Basically, everything I'd suspected from watching the footage was true, and probably worse than I'd even realized. The conversation got really weird when she started apologizing, but also trying to justify her behavior. She said I had such nice things and that she didn't think it was hurting anyone, since she was always careful to clean everything and put it back exactly where she found it. She actually seemed annoyed that I was upset about it, like I was being unreasonable for not wanting to share my most intimate belongings. I told her she had exactly 1 week to find a new place and move out, and that she needed to replace everything she'd used and pay for STD testing since I had no idea what she might have exposed me to. She tried to argue that she was clean and that I was overreacting, but I wasn't budging on any of it. She also had to pay to have my mattress and all my bedding professionally cleaned, since apparently she'd been using my bed as her personal relaxation space multiple times per week. The whole thing cost her over $600 by the time she replaced my personal items, paid for my testing, and covered the cleaning costs. The most disturbing part was how calculated the whole thing had been. She'd obviously been planning this from early on in our living arrangement, learning my schedule and figuring out when she'd have uninterrupted access to my room. She'd even bought cleaning supplies specifically for sanitizing my belongings after she used them, which meant she'd been thinking about hygiene, but not about the fundamental violation of using someone else's personal items without permission. She moved out within 5 days, which was honestly a relief because living with her after discovering what she'd been doing felt completely impossible. I couldn't look at her without thinking about all the footage I'd watched of her, going through my private belongings and using my most intimate items. I ended up throwing out most of my underwear and replacing all my bedding, even after having everything professionally cleaned. I just couldn't get past the knowledge of what had been happening in my own bedroom without my knowledge. I also installed a lock on my bedroom door, which I should have done from the beginning. The whole experience made me realize how much trust is involved in sharing living space with someone, and how easy it is for that trust to be violated in ways you'd never even think to watch out for. I mean, who puts hidden cameras in their own bedroom to catch their roommate using their personal items? It's not exactly a scenario you plan for when you're interviewing potential roommates. Sarah tried to stay in touch after she moved out, sending texts apologizing and asking if we could still be friends. I never responded. Some boundaries, once crossed, can't be uncrossed, and I couldn't imagine ever feeling comfortable around her again. From roommate violations to workplace betrayals, this next story shows how quickly professional relationships can turn toxic. I'd been working toward the senior analyst position at my company for 8 months, putting in extra hours and consistently exceeding my targets. When they finally announced the opening, I knew this was my shot. The position required a comprehensive presentation to the executive team about improving client retention strategies, and I was determined to nail it. This wasn't just any presentation either. It was essentially the final interview for a role that would mean a 30% salary increase and finally getting the recognition I'd been working toward for years. I spent 3 weeks developing what I genuinely believed was a groundbreaking approach to client retention. I researched industry trends, analyzed our current client data, and created detailed projections showing how my strategy could increase retention rates by 18% over the next fiscal year. I was working late every night, refining charts, perfecting my talking points, and making sure every single slide was flawless. This presentation was going to be my masterpiece, the thing that finally proved I was ready for senior-level responsibilities. My coworker Jake had been incredibly supportive throughout the whole process, which I really appreciated since we were technically competing for the same position. He'd often stay late when I was working, offering to grab coffee or just chatting about work stuff. He seemed genuinely interested in my ideas and would ask thoughtful questions about my research methods and data analysis. I thought it was nice to have a colleague who was competitive but still professional about it. Jake would often lean over my shoulder to look at my screen when I was explaining something, and he was always eager to help brainstorm solutions when I hit roadblocks. He even offered to review my presentation slides and give feedback, though I politely declined since we were technically competitors. Looking back, I should have found it weird how interested he was in the specifics of my strategy, but at the time, I just thought he was being a good colleague. The presentation was scheduled for Monday morning at 9, and I planned to spend Sunday evening doing one final review and practicing my delivery. I'd been feeling confident all week, knowing that my research was solid and my strategy was innovative. I got to the office around 6 on Sunday to print materials and do a final run-through in the conference room. That's when everything went completely sideways. When I opened my laptop, every single file related to my presentation was corrupted. Not just corrupted, completely unreadable. 3 weeks of work, gone. My PowerPoint wouldn't open. My research documents were showing error messages, and even my backup files on the desktop were damaged. I spent 2 hours trying everything I could think of, running virus scans, trying file recovery software, even calling the IT help desk, but nothing worked. I was having a complete panic attack. The presentation was in 15 hours, and I had nothing. All my charts, all my data analysis, all my carefully crafted talking points, everything was just gone. I called my manager and explained what happened, and she said I could postpone by a day or two to recover my files, but that would mean presenting after Jake, which would put me at a serious disadvantage. I barely slept that night, trying to recreate what I could from memory and cobbling together a basic presentation from scratch. It wasn't anywhere near the quality of what I'd originally prepared, but it was better than nothing. I showed up Monday morning feeling defeated and unprepared, the complete opposite of how I'd planned to feel during the most important presentation of my career. Then came the breaking point. Jake presented first, and I sat there watching him deliver my exact presentation. Not similar ideas, not the same general approach, but word for word the strategy I'd spent 3 weeks developing. He had my charts, my data analysis, my specific recommendations, even my unique terminology for describing different client segments. He was standing up there presenting my work as if he'd developed it himself and doing it confidently and smoothly like he'd been practicing for weeks. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, watching someone steal months of my work and present it to the executives who would decide my career future. Jake was even using my specific phrasing about proactive engagement touchpoints and value perception optimization, terms I'd coined specifically for this strategy. There was no way this was a coincidence or parallel thinking. This was straight up theft. The executives were eating it up, asking detailed questions that Jake answered perfectly because they were my ideas and my research. He talked about implementation timelines and resource requirements with the exact specifics I'd calculated. When they asked about potential challenges, he gave responses that were nearly identical to what I'd prepared for those same questions. I sat there feeling sick to my stomach, watching my promotion slip away as Jake presented my work better than I probably could have in my panicked, sleep-deprived state. The worst part was that he kept glancing at me with this smug expression, like he was enjoying watching me realize what had happened. The guy basically turned intellectual property theft into performance art. When it was my turn to present, I had to stand up there with my hastily thrown together slides and try to present ideas that Jake had literally just pitched as his own. Everything I said sounded like I was copying him, even though it was the other way around. The executives kept making comments like, "Oh, that's similar to what Jake suggested," or "interesting that you both came to similar conclusions independently." It was humiliating and infuriating, and I could barely get through my presentation without losing my composure completely. I knew I looked unprepared and unoriginal, and there was nothing I could do about it without sounding like I was making excuses or accusing Jake of something I couldn't prove. But that wasn't even the worst part. After the presentations, Jake actually had the audacity to come up to me and say he thought my ideas were really interesting, and that it was funny how we'd both come up with such similar strategies. He suggested that maybe we could collaborate on implementation, since our approaches were so aligned. The nerve of this guy was absolutely unbelievable. That's when it hit me that this hadn't been some last-minute opportunistic theft. Jake had been planning this for weeks, systematically gathering my research and ideas while pretending to be supportive and friendly. All those late nights when he'd stayed to chat, all those questions about my methodology, all those times he'd looked over my shoulder at my screen, he'd been stealing my work piece by piece. I started thinking back to all our interactions over the past few weeks, and it became obvious that he'd been taking photos of my screen when I wasn't paying attention. He'd always have his phone out when we were talking, and I'd assumed he was just checking messages, but he'd probably been photographing my research and analysis. I realized he'd been playing a long game, gathering intelligence while I thought we were just having collegial conversations about work. Every time I'd explained my thinking or walked him through my analysis, he'd been mentally cataloguing it for his own use. The man had basically been running a corporate espionage operation from the desk next to mine. That night I went home feeling completely defeated, assuming Jake had won and that I'd have to wait months or maybe years for another opportunity like this. But then I remembered that I'd been backing up my work to a cloud service that kept version histories. It was a long shot, but maybe I could recover enough of my original files to prove what had happened. What happened next turned everything around completely. I spent hours going through cloud backups and recovered almost everything, including timestamps that proved when I'd created each piece of the presentation. I had original drafts, revision histories, and metadata that clearly showed I'd been developing these ideas for weeks before Jake's presentation. I even found email drafts I'd written to myself with ideas and research notes, all dated well before Jake claimed to have developed the strategy. The next morning, I requested an emergency meeting with my manager and the executives who'd attended the presentations. I brought printed copies of my recovered files, complete with creation dates and revision histories. I laid out a timeline showing how I'd developed each component of the strategy, with documentation proving when each idea had been created and refined. The evidence was overwhelming. My original research files, my initial brainstorming documents, even my early draft slides with different formatting, everything pointed to Jake having stolen my work wholesale. The executives were horrified when they realized what had happened, especially since they'd already been leaning toward giving Jake the promotion based on his presentation. When they confronted Jake with the evidence, he initially tried to claim that we'd been collaborating and that the ideas had developed organically through our conversations. But when they pressed him on specific details and timelines, his story fell apart completely. He couldn't explain how he'd developed complex data analysis that I had documented creating weeks earlier, or why his original charts had metadata showing they'd been created on my laptop. The investigation revealed that Jake had been systematically photographing my screen during our conversations and had even accessed my computer when I'd stepped away without logging out. It found evidence that he'd been copying files from my workstation and had even installed monitoring software to track when I was working on the project. Jake was fired that same day, not just for stealing my work, but for corporate espionage and violating computer access policies. The company took it seriously because they realized that if he'd steal from a colleague, he could just as easily steal from clients or competitors. I got the promotion immediately, along with a formal apology from management and additional responsibilities that included overseeing Jake's former accounts. They also implemented new policies about information security and colleague collaboration to prevent something like this from happening again. The best part was that Jake had to sit through a meeting where they explained exactly how they'd traced the theft back to him, including showing him the metadata evidence and computer access logs. He went from smug and confident to completely defeated in about 15 minutes. His plan was so elaborate and required so much effort that he probably could have just developed his own strategy in the same amount of time. Instead, he chose to risk his entire career to steal work that he then couldn't even properly defend when questioned about specifics. The whole experience taught me to be way more careful about information security and to trust my instincts when something feels off about a colleague's behavior. Jake had been so convincing in his supportive colleague act that I'd never suspected he was systematically stealing my work. But looking back, all the signs were there. I also learned to keep much better documentation of my work processes, not just for situations like this, but for my own reference and development. Having those cloud backups and version histories saved my career and exposed Jake's theft in a way that left no room for doubt or interpretation. But professional theft is nothing compared to what happens when family members cross the ultimate line. Getting married in 3 weeks should have been the most exciting time of my life, and for the most part, it was. My fiancé David and I had been planning our dream wedding for over a year, and everything was finally coming together perfectly. The venue was booked, the catering was confirmed, and I had the most beautiful custom wedding dress that had taken 4 months to make and cost $3,000. It was everything I'd ever imagined for my special day. My sister Lisa had been involved in the wedding planning from the beginning, and she seemed genuinely excited for me. She'd helped me pick out decorations, went dress shopping with me for the bridesmaids' gowns, and even threw me a beautiful bridal shower 2 months before the wedding. Lisa had always been the competitive type, ever since we were kids, but she seemed to have outgrown that sibling rivalry and was being incredibly supportive throughout the whole process. Lisa's 2 years older than me and had been in a long-term relationship with her boyfriend Mark for about 5 years. They'd talked about marriage occasionally, but Mark seemed content to just keep things the way they were, and Lisa had always said she wasn't in any rush to get engaged. She had a good career, they lived together, and she claimed she didn't need a piece of paper to validate their relationship. At least, that's what she always told everyone. During the wedding planning, Lisa was actually one of my most helpful resources. She had great taste and seemed to genuinely enjoy helping me make decisions about flowers, music, and all the little details that go into planning a wedding. She was my maid of honor, and I was so grateful to have a sister who was excited to be part of my big day, rather than resentful or jealous like some siblings can be. The week before the wedding, I decided to drive to my parents' house to pick up some childhood mementos I wanted to include in the wedding decorations. My parents had kept my old room mostly the same, and I thought it would be nice to incorporate some sentimental items into the reception centerpieces. I also wanted to hang my wedding dress in the familiar surroundings of my childhood bedroom for the final week, just for the emotional significance of getting ready in the room where I'd dreamed about my wedding day as a little girl. When I opened the closet door in my old bedroom, I literally screamed. My beautiful custom wedding dress was hanging there, but it had been completely destroyed. Someone had taken scissors to it and shredded it into ribbons. The bodice was slashed in multiple places, the skirt was cut into strips, and the delicate beading and lacework that had taken months to complete was ruined beyond any possibility of repair. I stood there staring at the remnants of my dress, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't accidental damage or some kind of weird storage accident. Someone had deliberately and methodically destroyed my wedding dress with obvious malicious intent. The cuts were clean and purposeful, like someone had spent significant time carefully ruining every single part of the dress. My first thought was that maybe someone had broken into my parents' house, but that didn't make sense because nothing else was disturbed, and who would break in just to destroy a wedding dress? Then I thought maybe there'd been some kind of accident with a pet or something, but my parents don't have any animals, and this was clearly deliberate damage. When I called my parents and Lisa over to see what had happened, Lisa's reaction was the first thing that made me suspicious. Everyone else was shocked and horrified, but Lisa seemed more nervous than surprised. She kept asking weird questions about whether I was sure the dress had been hanging there properly, and whether maybe the hanger had somehow caused the damage. Lisa suggested that maybe the dress had been defective and had somehow torn on its own, which was completely ridiculous given the obvious scissor marks and the fact that the damage was so systematic and thorough. When my mum pointed out that the cuts were clearly deliberate, Lisa got defensive and said we shouldn't jump to conclusions about what had happened. That's when it clicked for me that Lisa's behavior was really strange. She wasn't asking who could have done this or expressing outrage about someone destroying my dress. Instead, she was making excuses and trying to downplay the obvious reality that someone had intentionally ruined my wedding dress 3 weeks before my wedding. The way she's deflecting instead of being furious on my behalf is honestly telling me everything I need to know. When I directly asked Lisa if she knew anything about what happened to my dress, she initially denied it completely. She said she'd been at work all week and hadn't even been to my parents' house, which I knew wasn't true because my mum had mentioned that Lisa had stopped by a few days earlier to drop off some wedding favors, but when I pressed her about when she'd actually been there last, her story started falling apart. She kept changing details about when she'd visited and what she'd been doing there, and she was getting more and more agitated as I asked follow-up questions. Finally, she broke down crying and admitted that she'd destroyed my dress. The reason she gave me was devastating. Lisa said she'd been feeling increasingly jealous and resentful as my wedding approached because she desperately wanted to get married herself, but Mark wasn't ready to propose. She said watching me plan my dream wedding had made her realize how badly she wanted that for herself, and she couldn't handle seeing me get everything she wanted while she felt stuck in a relationship that wasn't progressing. She claimed that destroying my dress had been an impulsive decision made during an emotional breakdown, and that she immediately regretted it but didn't know how to fix what she'd done. She begged me to forgive her and said she'd pay for a replacement dress, but 3 weeks before a wedding, finding a replacement for a custom gown is basically impossible. I was absolutely devastated, not just about the dress, but about the fact that my sister, who I'd trusted completely and who was supposed to be my maid of honor, had deliberately sabotaged my wedding out of jealousy. The betrayal felt almost worse than the actual destruction of the dress, but that wasn't even the worst part. Over the next few days, as I was frantically trying to find a replacement dress and dealing with the emotional trauma of what Lisa had done, I started getting strange phone calls from wedding vendors. My florist called to confirm the cancellation of my wedding flowers. My venue coordinator wanted to discuss rescheduling options since we'd apparently postponed the wedding. Even my photographer was confused about whether we were still planning to have the ceremony on the scheduled date. At first, I thought these were just weird coincidences or mix-ups, but as more vendors called with similar stories, I realized that someone had been systematically contacting them to cancel or postpone various aspects of my wedding. When I asked each vendor who had called them, they all described a woman who claimed to be me and said there had been a family emergency requiring us to postpone the wedding. Then I started getting calls from confused wedding guests who had received emails saying the wedding was being postponed indefinitely due to personal circumstances. The emails looked like they'd come from me, but I definitely hadn't sent them. About half of my guest list had received these cancellation emails, all sent from a fake email account that was designed to look like mine. I felt like I was living in a nightmare where someone was systematically dismantling my wedding piece by piece. Every day brought new discoveries of things that had been cancelled or postponed without my knowledge. My cake decorator, my music coordinator, even my transportation service for the bridal party, someone had contacted all of them claiming to be me and cancelling their services. When I confronted Lisa about the vendor cancellations and the emails to my guests, she completely fell apart. She admitted that after destroying my dress, she'd panicked and decided to try to postpone the entire wedding to buy time to figure out how to fix what she'd done. She thought if she could delay everything by a few weeks, she could somehow make things right and I'd never have to know about the dress. Her logic was completely insane. She thought she could secretly postpone my entire wedding, somehow replace my custom dress, and then unpostpone everything without me ever finding out what had happened. The level of delusional thinking required to believe that plan could work was honestly mind-blowing, and here's where it gets absurd. Lisa also admitted that she'd been hoping that postponing the wedding might give Mark the push he needed to propose to her first. She'd apparently been telling him about how stressful wedding planning was for me, and how maybe we were rushing into marriage too quickly. She thought if my wedding got delayed, it might motivate him to propose so they could beat us to the altar. The woman had basically tried to destroy my wedding, to manipulate her boyfriend into proposing to her. She'd risked our entire relationship and traumatized me during what should have been the happiest time of my life, all because she wanted to get engaged first. When my parents found out the full extent of what Lisa had done, they were absolutely furious. They made her pay for a rush replacement dress, which cost twice as much as my original gown because of the expedited timeline, and they forced her to spend the next 2 weeks calling every vendor and guest to explain what had happened and fix the cancellations. Lisa had to personally call each of my wedding guests and explain that she'd sent fake cancellation emails due to a personal crisis and that the wedding was definitely still happening as scheduled. She had to grovel to vendors who were understandably confused and annoyed about the fake cancellations, and she had to pay rush fees to several of them to guarantee their services would still be available. I also cut her out of the wedding party entirely. There was no way I could have someone who'd actively sabotage my wedding standing beside me as my maid of honor. My best friend stepped in to take over those responsibilities, and Lisa wasn't even invited to the rehearsal dinner or any of the pre-wedding events. The wedding itself ended up being absolutely perfect, partly because everyone who attended was extra supportive after hearing about what had happened. My new dress was actually even more beautiful than the original, and all the vendors went out of their way to make sure everything was flawless. But the damage to my relationship with Lisa was permanent. Even though she paid for everything and spent weeks trying to make amends, I couldn't get past the fact that she deliberately tried to destroy the most important day of my life out of jealousy. The level of selfishness and cruelty it took to do what she did showed me a side of her that I'd never seen before. Our parents were also permanently affected by what happened. They felt guilty for not seeing the warning signs of Lisa's jealousy, and they struggled with how to maintain relationships with both of us after such a serious betrayal. Family gatherings became awkward and tense, and we've never really recovered the close relationship we used to have. Lisa and Mark actually did break up about 6 months after my wedding. Apparently, her behavior during my wedding crisis made him realize some things about her character that he didn't like, and he decided he wasn't ready to commit to someone who could be so destructive when she didn't get her way. Looking back, I think Lisa's jealousy had been building for a long time, but she'd been hiding it well until the stress of actually watching me get married pushed her over the edge. The competitive dynamic we'd had as kids had never really gone away. She'd just gotten better at hiding it as an adult. She basically torched every important relationship in her life because she couldn't handle seeing someone else be happy. The whole experience taught me that jealousy can make people do things you'd never expect, even people you trust completely. I'd never imagined that my own sister could be capable of such deliberate cruelty, but I learned that family relationships don't automatically protect you from betrayal. Wedding sabotage is brutal, but imagine discovering your partner has been living a complete double life. Dating Mark for 8 months felt like I'd finally found my person. He was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely committed to building something real with me. We'd met through a mutual friend at a networking event, and the chemistry was instant. Mark worked in consulting, which explained why he traveled so frequently for client meetings, but when he was home, he was completely present and attentive. He'd bring me flowers, plan thoughtful dates, and we'd spend entire weekends together just enjoying each other's company. The relationship progressed naturally, and everything felt perfectly normal and healthy. Mark was emotionally available, communicated well, and never gave me any reason to doubt his intentions. He talked about future plans, introduced me to some of his friends, and seemed genuinely excited about where things were heading between us. We'd even started discussing the possibility of moving in together, maybe finding a nice apartment closer to both our jobs. His travel schedule was pretty intense, with him being gone about 10 days each month for various client projects, but he was always good about staying in touch when he was away. He'd text throughout the day, call every evening, and send photos from whatever city he was visiting. The consistency of his communication actually made me feel more secure about the relationship, not less. He never seemed evasive about his work or where he was going, and he always came back with stories and details about his trips. Mark had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in his world, even with his demanding work schedule. He'd plan special things for when he got back from trips, remember little details about things I'd mentioned while he was away, and always made sure to carve out quality time for us despite his busy calendar. I felt lucky to have found someone who could balance a demanding career with being a thoughtful, present partner. We'd been talking about taking the next step and finding a place together, maybe somewhere with a little more space than my current apartment. Mark seemed enthusiastic about the idea and had even started looking at listings in neighborhoods we both liked. He'd send me links to apartments during his lunch breaks, and we'd talk about what features were most important to us in a shared living space. Everything changed during what should have been a perfectly ordinary dinner date. We were at our usual Thai restaurant, and Mark's phone died right as he was trying to show me photos from his latest business trip to Chicago. He'd been telling me about this amazing architecture he'd seen, and I was excited to see the pictures. When his phone wouldn't turn on, he suggested we could look at them on his laptop when we got back to my place. Back at my apartment, Mark opened his laptop and was navigating to his photo folder when his email program automatically opened and started syncing new messages. I wasn't trying to snoop or anything, but the screen was facing toward me, and I couldn't help but notice several recent emails from someone named Emily, with subject lines that made my stomach drop. The most recent email had a subject line about mortgage payment due, and another one about anniversary dinner reservations. There was also one that said, concerned about your recent travel schedule, that had been sent just 2 days earlier. These weren't the kind of emails you get from a coworker or a friend. They were obviously from someone Mark was in a very intimate relationship with. I tried to act normal and not let on that I'd seen anything, but my mind was racing. Who was Emily, and why was she discussing mortgage payments and anniversary plans with my boyfriend? Mark seemed completely oblivious to what I'd seen, and was focused on finding his photos, chatting casually about his trip, while I sat there trying to process what those email subject lines could possibly mean. When Mark went to the bathroom, I made a split-second decision that I knew was wrong but felt necessary. I quickly opened one of the emails from Emily, and what I read made me feel like the floor had dropped out from under me. Emily was talking about their mortgage payment being due next week and asking if Mark would be home in time for their anniversary dinner on Saturday. She also mentioned that the kids had been asking when Daddy would be home from his business trip. The kids, Daddy, anniversary dinner, mortgage payment. These weren't the words someone uses when talking to their boyfriend's co-worker or business partner. Emily was clearly Mark's wife, and they had children together. I quickly closed the email before Mark came back, but I felt like I was going to be sick. Everything about our relationship suddenly felt fake and disgusting. All those business trips, all that consistency in his communication, all those future plans we'd been making, it was all built on a foundation of lies. I was the other woman, and I hadn't even known it. This is the kind of thing you see in movies and think, how could someone not know? But when you're living it, it's terrifyingly easy to miss the signs. I managed to get through the rest of the evening by pretending everything was normal, but inside I was completely falling apart. Mark stayed over like he usually did when he didn't have early morning meetings, and I lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me hoped I'd misunderstood something, that there was some explanation that didn't involve Mark being married with children. The next day, while Mark was at work, I did something that I knew would either confirm my worst fears or prove that I'd jumped to the wrong conclusion. I looked up the address that had been mentioned in one of Emily's emails about a home repair estimate. It was in a suburban neighborhood about 40 minutes from where Mark and I usually spent time, in a completely different direction from where he'd told me he lived. But that wasn't even the worst part. I drove to the address, not really sure what I was hoping to accomplish, but needing to see for myself what was there. It was a beautiful 2-story house with a well-maintained yard and 2 cars in the driveway. Through the front windows, I could see family photos on the mantelpiece, and in those photos were Mark, a blonde woman who had to be Emily, and 2 young children who looked like miniature versions of Mark. I sat in my car across the street for about 20 minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some elaborate misunderstanding or coincidence. Mark had an entire family, an entire life that I knew nothing about. The house looked lived in and loved, with children's toys in the yard and family photos visible through the windows. This was clearly his real life, and I was just some side piece he entertained when he was supposedly traveling for work. The realization that I'd been completely played for 8 months was devastating, but what made it worse was thinking about Emily and those children. They thought Mark was away working hard to provide for their family, when actually he was with me, building a fake relationship based on lies. Emily was probably proud of her hard-working husband, who traveled so much for his career, never suspecting that he was using those trips as cover for maintaining a double life. I knew I had to tell Emily what was happening, even though it would destroy her world and probably end my relationship with Mark immediately. She deserved to know the truth about the man she was married to, and those children deserved better than a father who was living a lie. And suddenly the whole plan fell apart in the most dramatic way possible. I worked up the courage to knock on Emily's door, planning to somehow explain who I was and what I'd discovered. When she answered, I could see that she was even prettier in person than in the photos, and she had this warm, welcoming smile that made what I was about to tell her even more heartbreaking. Emily assumed I was one of Mark's work colleagues and invited me in for coffee, mentioning that Mark had told her so much about his co-workers and how supportive they'd been during his recent busy period. She was genuinely excited to meet someone from Mark's professional life and started telling me about how proud she was of Mark's dedication to his career and how grateful she was that he had such great people to work with. Sitting in their living room, surrounded by family photos and children's artwork, listening to Emily talk about how much she loved and trusted Mark was one of the most surreal and awful experiences of my life. I could see wedding photos on the side tables, pictures of Mark coaching what looked like his son's little league team, and family vacation photos that had obviously been taken during some of the weekends when Mark had told me he was away on business. When I finally told Emily who I really was and why I was there, her face went through about 10 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, horror, and finally this terrible understanding that everything she thought she knew about her life was wrong. She started crying, not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, but this quiet, devastating kind of crying that was somehow much worse. Emily asked me detailed questions about my relationship with Mark, comparing timelines and trying to figure out how he'd managed to maintain two separate lives for so long. We realized that some of his work trips had actually been long weekends with me, while some of the time he'd told me he was traveling, he'd been home with his family. The man had been running an elaborate scheduling operation to keep both relationships going without either of us knowing about the other. She showed me their wedding photos, pictures from their recent anniversary celebration that Mark had supposedly missed because of a work emergency, and videos of their children asking when Daddy would be home from his latest business trip. The level of deception was staggering, and Emily kept saying she couldn't believe she'd never suspected anything. Emily told me that Mark had been acting differently over the past few months, more distracted and secretive, but she'd attributed it to work stress and had actually been trying to be more supportive and understanding about his demanding schedule. She'd been making excuses for behavior that she now realized were probably signs of his double life. The confrontation with Mark happened the next day, when he came home from what Emily and I now knew had been a supposed work trip that was actually time spent with me. Emily had decided to confront him immediately rather than pretending everything was normal, and she asked me to be there when she did it. Mark walked into his house expecting a normal evening with his family, and instead found his wife and his girlfriend sitting together in his living room. The look on his face was something I'll never forget, this complete panic and realization that his entire carefully constructed lie had just collapsed in the worst possible way. He tried to deny everything at first, claiming I was just a work colleague who was confused about the nature of our relationship, but Emily had already seen too much evidence. She'd gone through his phone and computer after I left the day before and found months' worth of texts, photos, and emails that proved everything I'd told her was true. When Mark finally admitted to the affair, he tried to minimize it by saying it wasn't serious and that I didn't mean anything to him compared to his family, which was both insulting to me and devastating to Emily, who realized that Mark had been risking everything they'd built together for what he was now claiming was just casual fling. Emily filed for divorce within a week, and Mark lost everything. His house, his relationship with his children, his marriage, and obviously his relationship with me. The whole elaborate double life he'd constructed came crashing down in a matter of days, and he went from having two relationships to having none. I had to get tested for every STD imaginable because I had no idea what Mark's actual sexual history was or whether he'd been honest with me about anything related to his health. I also started therapy because the experience of discovering that someone I'd trusted completely had been lying to me about literally everything was more traumatic than I'd expected. The hardest part was realizing that nothing about our relationship had been real. Every sweet gesture, every future plan we'd discussed, every moment of intimacy, it had all been part of an elaborate deception. Mark had been performing the role of devoted boyfriend while maintaining his real life with Emily and their children. Looking back, there were probably signs I could have picked up on if I'd been more suspicious. But Mark had been so good at maintaining the lie that I'd never had any reason to doubt him. He'd been living this double life for months, maybe longer, and had gotten so comfortable with the deception that he'd started making mistakes like leaving his email open where I could see it. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts more and to pay attention to inconsistencies in people's stories, even when they seem minor. It also made me realize how important it is to really know someone before committing to a serious relationship, and how easy it is for someone to maintain a facade when you only see them part-time. Secret marriages are devastating, but at least that was one person's deception. This next story involves an entire family conspiracy. Mark's parents seemed like the ideal in-laws when we first got married 3 years ago. They were warm, welcoming, and always made an effort to include me in family traditions and conversations. His mum, Carol, would bring homemade cookies every time they visited, and his dad, Frank, was always offering to help with home improvement projects or car maintenance. They visited about once a month, usually staying for the whole weekend, and I genuinely looked forward to their visits during our first year of marriage. Carol and Frank were incredibly generous with gifts too, always bringing little things they'd picked up that reminded them of us, or contributing way more than necessary when we had family dinners. They seemed to really care about our happiness and our home, often commenting on new furniture we'd bought or improvements we'd made to the house. Frank would walk around admiring our electronics and asking detailed questions about where we'd bought things, while Carol would compliment my jewelry and ask about where I'd found certain pieces. For the longest time, I felt grateful to have in-laws who were so involved and interested in our lives. My own parents lived across the country, so having Mark's family nearby and engaged felt like a real blessing. They never seemed judgmental or intrusive, just genuinely excited to be part of our lives and supportive of our marriage. But sometime around our second year of marriage, I started noticing small things going missing after their visits. At first, it was just minor stuff that I assumed I'd misplaced or forgotten about. A $20 bill that I thought I'd left in my purse would be gone, or a piece of costume jewelry would disappear from my dresser. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness and didn't think much about it. The pattern became more obvious over time, though. After every single visit from Mark's parents, something small but valuable would be missing from our house. It was never anything huge or immediately noticeable, just small electronics, cash, jewelry, or gift cards that I wouldn't necessarily miss right away. The items were always things that could easily be pocketed and wouldn't be noticed missing for days or weeks. When I mentioned the missing items to Mark, he was completely dismissive and suggested that I was probably just misplacing things or forgetting where I'd put them. He said his parents had been generous and helpful our entire marriage, and it was insulting to even suggest they might be taking our belongings. He reminded me of all the gifts they'd given us and all the ways they'd helped us, and made me feel like I was being paranoid and ungrateful. I started keeping closer track of my belongings before and after their visits, making mental notes of where I'd left certain items and checking those spots after they left. The pattern was undeniable. My expensive earrings would disappear from my jewelry box, cash would go missing from my wallet, and even gift cards would vanish from the kitchen counter where I'd left them. The thefts were becoming more frequent and more bold. After one visit, my iPad disappeared from the bedroom nightstand. After another, an expensive watch that Mark had given me for our anniversary was gone from my dresser. These weren't small items that could be accidentally misplaced. They were valuable things that someone had deliberately taken. Mark continued to defend his parents and refused to even consider the possibility that they might be stealing from us. He said I was being ridiculous and that there had to be other explanations for the missing items. When I suggested we might want to be more careful about leaving valuables out during their visits, he got angry and said I was being disrespectful to his family. The gaslighting was honestly almost as frustrating as the actual theft. I decided to install hidden cameras throughout our house before their next visit, just to prove to myself and to Mark that I wasn't losing my mind. I got small wireless cameras that looked like everyday objects and placed them in our bedroom, living room, and kitchen. I didn't tell Mark about the cameras because I knew he'd object and probably warn his parents, even if he didn't mean to. The footage from their next visit was absolutely mind-blowing. I watched Carol and Frank systematically go through our belongings while Mark and I were in the kitchen preparing lunch. Carol would keep Mark distracted with conversation, while Frank wandered around the house, opening drawers, looking through closets, and taking photos of valuable items with his phone. They had an actual system worked out. Frank would scout locations and identify valuable items, taking pictures of serial numbers and price tags when possible. Carol would create diversions, asking Mark questions or requesting his help with something in another room, giving Frank uninterrupted access to our belongings. They moved through our house like professional thieves, clearly having done this many times before. During that single visit, I watched them take over $300 in cash from various places around our house, steal 2 pieces of my jewelry, and pocket several gift cards that had been sitting on our kitchen counter. They even took a small Bluetooth speaker from our bedroom and a bottle of expensive cologne from Mark's dresser. The most disturbing part was how casual and systematic they were about it. This wasn't impulsive behavior or someone taking advantage of an unexpected opportunity. They had clearly been planning these thefts and had developed an efficient method for stealing from us without getting caught. But that wasn't even the worst part. I kept watching the footage from previous visits after I'd installed more cameras and discovered that they'd been photographing our belongings to research their value before stealing them. Frank had been taking detailed photos of our electronics, jewelry, and other valuables, probably to look up their worth online and decide which items were worth the risk of taking. They were also going through our personal documents, photographing our bank statements and credit card bills, presumably to get information about our financial situation. Frank had been taking pictures of our mail, our tax documents, and even our computer screens when we'd left laptops open in common areas. The level of violation was staggering. They weren't just stealing our belongings, they were conducting surveillance on our entire financial life. They knew how much money we had, what we spent it on, and probably had enough personal information to steal our identities if they wanted to. I also realized they'd been gradually escalating their thefts over time, starting with small amounts of cash and working up to more valuable items as they got more comfortable and confident that they wouldn't get caught. The missing items I'd noticed were probably just the tip of the iceberg, and they'd likely been taking things I hadn't even realized were gone. When I showed Mark the camera footage, his first reaction was complete disbelief. He watched his parents systematically robbing our house and kept saying it couldn't be real, that there had to be some other explanation. Even with video evidence of his parents pocketing our belongings, he struggled to accept what he was seeing. Things went from bad to unhinged when I decided to confront them during their next visit. I waited until Sunday dinner, when we were all sitting around the table having what seemed like a normal family meal. Carol was complimenting the roast I'd made, and Frank was telling Mark about some home improvement project he was working on. They seemed completely relaxed and comfortable, just like always. I excused myself from the table, got my laptop, and came back with the camera footage queued up and ready to play. I set the laptop on the dining room table and hit play, showing them crystal clear video of Frank going through our bedroom dresser, while Carol distracted Mark in the kitchen. The silence in that room was deafening. Carol and Frank both went completely white, and Mark just stared at the screen with his mouth hanging open. I let the footage play for about 2 minutes, showing them taking cash, jewelry, and electronics from various rooms in our house. Their first response was to deny that it was them in the video, despite the footage clearly showing their faces and the clothes they were wearing that same day. When that obviously didn't work, they tried to claim that they were just looking at our things and hadn't actually taken anything. Frank then switched tactics and said they were borrowing items and had always planned to return them. They just forgot to mention it. He claimed they'd taken the cash to buy us a surprise gift and had borrowed my jewelry to have it appraised as a favor to us. The excuses were so ridiculous that they would have been funny if the situation wasn't so devastating. When I asked them to empty their pockets and purse right there at the dinner table, they found every excuse not to do it. Carol said she'd left her purse in the car, and Frank claimed he didn't have anything in his pockets. They were clearly stalling and trying to figure out how to get out of the situation without further incriminating themselves. I told them that if they didn't empty their pockets immediately, I was calling the police. That's when Carol broke down crying and started pulling items out of her purse, including 2 of my rings, several gift cards, and over $200 in cash that I recognized from various places around our house. Frank finally emptied his pockets and had my Bluetooth speaker, Mark's cologne, and more cash. They'd literally been stealing from us during dinner, probably planning to pocket additional items on their way out the door. The confrontation got even more surreal when they started blaming us for tempting them by leaving valuable items out in the open. Carol said we were careless with our belongings and that we obviously didn't appreciate what we had since we left expensive things lying around where anyone could take them. They actually tried to make themselves the victims, claiming that we'd set them up by installing cameras and that we'd violated their privacy by recording them without permission. Frank said we were being ungrateful after everything they'd done for us, and that families should be able to trust each other without surveillance. When we searched their car before they left, we found thousands of dollars worth of our belongings that they'd apparently stolen over the course of multiple visits. Electronics, jewelry, cash, gift cards, even some of my expensive makeup and skincare products. They'd been systematically looting our house for over a year, and we'd only noticed a fraction of what they had actually taken. Mark was completely devastated by the discovery. He'd spent our entire marriage defending his parents and making me feel crazy for suspecting them. And now he was forced to confront the fact that they'd been stealing from us the whole time. The betrayal hit him even harder than it hit me, because he'd trusted them completely, and they'd used that trust to rob us blind. We pressed charges and went completely no contact with both of them. The legal process was complicated because they tried to claim that we'd given them permission to take the items, but the camera footage made it pretty clear that they were stealing, not borrowing with permission. Carol and Frank ended up pleading guilty to theft charges and had to pay restitution, though we never recovered everything they'd stolen because some items had already been sold or given away. They also had to return items they still had in their possession, which turned out to be more stuff than we'd even realized was missing. The impact on Mark was devastating. He'd lost his relationship with his parents and felt guilty for not believing me when I tried to tell him what was happening. He also felt responsible for bringing people into our home who'd violated our trust and stolen from us for over a year. Our marriage survived, but holidays and family gatherings became incredibly awkward since we were no contact with half of Mark's family. Other relatives tried to mediate and convince us to forgive Carol and Frank, but we couldn't get past the systematic nature of what they'd done and the fact that they'd shown no real remorse. The whole experience taught us both to trust our instincts and to take theft seriously, even when it involves family members. The idea that parents would steal from their own son and daughter-in-law was so foreign to both of us that we'd ignored obvious signs for way too long. Looking back, there were probably other warning signs we should have noticed, like how interested they always were in our financial situation and how they always seemed to know exactly where we kept valuable items in our house. They'd been casing our home for months, learning our routines and identifying the best opportunities for theft. Family theft cuts deep, but sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those closest to our hearts. Jessica and I had been best friends for 10 years, the kind of friendship where we knew everything about each other and could pick up conversations like no time had passed, even after weeks of being busy. We'd met in college during our sophomore year and had been through everything together. Breakups, family drama, career changes, you name it. She was the person I called when something amazing happened, and she was also the person I turned to when my world was falling apart. When I started dating David, Jessica was genuinely excited for me. I'd been single for a while after a pretty rough breakup, and she watched me work through trust issues and get to a place where I was ready to open up to someone new. David was different from guys I'd dated before, more mature, more emotionally available, and actually interested in building something real instead of just having fun. After David and I had been together for about 2 years, I introduced him to Jessica at a group dinner with some of our mutual friends. They hit it off immediately, which made me so happy because having your best friend and your boyfriend get along is honestly one of the best feelings in the world. Jessica was charming and funny, and David seemed to really appreciate her sense of humor and her loyalty to me as a friend. The three of us started hanging out together pretty regularly, especially when I had to work late or travel for my job. David and Jessica would grab dinner or see movies, always keeping me in the loop about their plans and often sending me photos from whatever they were doing. I felt so grateful to have two people I cared about who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and who made an effort to include me even when I couldn't be there. Jessica had always been the type of friend who was protective of me and invested in my relationships. She'd been the one to help me recognize red flags with previous boyfriends, and she'd celebrated with me when those relationships ended and I found someone better. With David, she seemed genuinely happy that I'd found someone who treated me well and made me laugh. She'd often comment on how good David was for me and how much happier I seemed since we'd been together. For about 6 months, everything was perfect. The three of us had this great dynamic where we could all hang out together, but David and Jessica could also spend time as friends without it being weird or threatening to my relationship. I trusted them both completely, and it felt like I'd finally found that ideal situation where your partner and your best friend actually like each other. Then David started acting strange in ways that made no sense given how solid our relationship had been. He'd ask weird questions about where I was going when I went out with coworkers, or he'd seem suspicious when I got texts from people he didn't know. He started questioning things about my past that we'd already talked through extensively, asking for more details about previous relationships or friendships that had never been an issue before. The change in his behavior was gradual but noticeable. David went from being secure and trusting to constantly seeking reassurance about my feelings for him and my commitment to our relationship. He'd ask if I was happy, if I was thinking about breaking up with him, if there was someone else I was interested in. These were completely out of character questions for someone who'd never shown signs of jealousy or insecurity before. I tried to reassure him and figure out what was causing this sudden shift in his confidence about our relationship. When I asked him directly what was wrong, he'd say he was just feeling insecure and needed more affirmation from me. But his specific questions and concerns seemed to come out of nowhere, and I couldn't understand what had triggered this change in someone who'd always been so secure. The questioning got more intense and more specific over time. David would ask about particular nights when I'd been out, wanting detailed accounts of who I'd talked to and what we'd discussed. He'd bring up names of people I'd mentioned in passing and ask if I had feelings for them, or if anything had ever happened between us. It felt like he was building a case about something, but I had no idea what evidence he thought he was gathering. Honestly, it's like watching someone you love slowly lose their mind over things that aren't even real. Then came the breaking point when David directly asked me if I was cheating on him. The question came completely out of left field during what had been a normal conversation about weekend plans. He said he'd been hearing things that made him question my loyalty, and he needed to know if there was someone else in my life that I wasn't being honest about. I was completely blindsided by the accusation and immediately asked him what he'd heard and who he'd been talking to. David was reluctant to give me specifics, but he eventually admitted that Jessica had been sharing concerns about my behavior and had shown him evidence that suggested I might be seeing someone else behind his back. My heart sank as I realized that my best friend had been feeding lies to my boyfriend and systematically destroying his trust in me. David showed me screenshots of text conversations that Jessica claimed were between me and various guys, messages that suggested I was meeting up with people and talking about David in disrespectful ways. The conversations looked real enough that I could understand why David would be concerned, but I knew I'd never sent those messages. The fake texts were convincing because they included details about my life and schedule that only someone close to me would know. Jessica had created conversations that referenced real events and real people, but had fabricated my responses to make it look like I was living a double life. She'd even included messages that made it sound like I was planning to break up with David, but was staying with him for financial reasons or convenience. David had been carrying this evidence around for weeks, trying to decide whether to confront me or just end the relationship. He'd been analyzing my behavior through the lens of these fake conversations, looking for signs that would confirm what Jessica had told him. Every late night at work, every friendly interaction with a male colleague, every time I'd been tired or distracted, he'd been interpreting it as proof that I was cheating. I immediately recognized the conversations as fake because I knew my own texting style and the content of the messages didn't match anything I'd ever said or thought. But I could also see how someone who loved me and trusted my best friend would be devastated by what appeared to be evidence of betrayal. Jessica had been strategic about creating content that would be hurtful and believable, but that wasn't even the worst part. When I confronted Jessica about the fake screenshots, she initially denied everything and claimed that David must have misunderstood something she'd said. She suggested that maybe he was feeling insecure about our relationship and was looking for problems that didn't exist. She even offered to talk to him and reassure him that I was completely loyal and trustworthy. Her willingness to continue the lie even after being directly confronted was what really showed me how calculated this whole thing had been. Jessica wasn't just spreading rumors or sharing concerns, she'd been actively working to destroy my relationship while pretending to be supportive of both me and David. I decided to set up a meeting with Jessica where I could get her to admit what she'd been doing, and I secretly recorded the conversation on my phone. I told her that David and I were having serious problems because of the things she'd told him, and I asked her to help me understand what she'd shared with him and why. At first, Jessica stuck to her story and claimed she'd only shared legitimate concerns about some of the people I'd been spending time with. But when I pressed her about the specific text screenshots, she eventually broke down and admitted that she'd created them herself. She said she'd been watching me be happy with David for 2 years and had realized that she was in love with him herself. Jessica confessed that she'd been hoping that if she could break us up, David might turn to her for comfort and support, and eventually realized that she was a better match for him than I was. She'd been playing the long game, slowly planting seeds of doubt in David's mind, while positioning herself as the loyal friend who was looking out for his best interests. The recording captured Jessica admitting that she'd made up the text conversations, that she'd been lying about my behavior and my feelings, and that her ultimate goal was to steal my boyfriend. She also admitted that she'd been encouraging David's insecurities and feeding him information designed to make him question my loyalty and commitment. When I played the recording for David, he was absolutely horrified. He couldn't believe that someone he'd trusted and considered a friend had been systematically manipulating him to destroy our relationship. He felt guilty for believing the lies and for questioning my loyalty based on fabricated evidence. David apologized profusely for doubting me and for allowing Jessica to poison his perception of our relationship. He said he'd known something felt wrong about the whole situation, but had trusted Jessica because she was my best friend, and he couldn't imagine she'd lie about something so serious. He was angry at himself for not coming to me directly when the doubts started instead of letting them build up over weeks. I cut Jessica out of my life completely and immediately. 10 years of friendship ended in a single conversation when I realized that she'd been willing to destroy my happiness to pursue her own selfish goals. The betrayal was devastating because I'd trusted her with everything, and she'd used that trust to systematically sabotage the most important relationship in my life. The aftermath was complicated because David and I had to rebuild trust that had been damaged by Jessica's lies. Even though we both knew the accusations were false, the experience of having our relationship questioned and analyzed had created insecurities that took time to work through. David had to learn to trust his own instincts again, instead of looking for signs of problems that didn't exist. We also had to navigate the social fallout of cutting Jessica out of our lives. She'd been integrated into our friend group and our social activities, so removing her meant changing a lot of our routines and relationships. Some mutual friends took sides or tried to mediate, which created additional drama and stress. Jessica tried to reach out multiple times after I confronted her, claiming that she'd made a mistake and that our friendship was more important than any romantic feelings she had for David. She said she'd been going through a difficult time and had made poor decisions because she was lonely and jealous of my happiness. I never responded to any of her attempts to reconcile. The level of planning and manipulation that had gone into her scheme showed me a side of her character that I'd never seen before, and I couldn't imagine ever trusting her again. Someone who would spend months systematically destroying their best friend's relationship while pretending to be supportive was not someone I wanted in my life. David and I are stronger now than we were before, partly because we went through something difficult together and came out on the other side. We learned to communicate more directly about our concerns and insecurities, and we developed better boundaries around outside influences on our relationship. The experience taught us both to trust each other more than we trust anyone else, even close friends. The trust issues do linger though. I'm more cautious about sharing relationship details with friends, and David is more skeptical when people bring him concerns about my behavior. We both learned that even people you trust completely can have hidden agendas, and that jealousy can make people capable of cruelty you'd never expect from them. Looking back, there were probably signs of Jessica's feelings for David that I missed because I trusted her so completely. She'd always been a little too interested in the details of our relationship, and she'd seemed to enjoy spending time with David, even when I wasn't around. But I'd interpreted that as her being a good friend who cared about my happiness, not as someone who was developing feelings for my boyfriend. The whole experience taught me that friendships, like romantic relationships, require ongoing trust and communication. Just because someone has been loyal for years doesn't mean they'll always have your best interests at heart, especially when their own desires conflict with your happiness. Romantic manipulation is cruel, but financial betrayal can destroy lives in ways that last decades. Starting a food truck business with Tom felt like the perfect opportunity to turn our shared passion for cooking into something profitable and meaningful. We'd been friends since college, where we'd bonded over late-night cooking sessions in our dorm kitchen and dreams of someday opening our own restaurant. Tom had a business degree and natural leadership skills, while I had culinary training and experience managing kitchen operations. When we finally decided to take the leap and start our own venture, it felt like all the pieces were falling into place perfectly. We each invested $50,000 of our life savings into the business, money we'd both been carefully saving for years, with the specific goal of starting something together. That $100,000 covered everything we needed to get started: a fully equipped food truck, all the necessary permits and licenses, initial inventory, insurance, and enough working capital to sustain us through the first few months while we built our customer base. The planning process took almost a year, and Tom handled most of the business side while I focused on menu development and operational logistics. He researched locations, handled permit applications, managed our relationship with suppliers, and set up all our financial systems, including our business bank account. I trusted him completely to handle those aspects because business management was his area of expertise, and I was busy perfecting recipes and planning our kitchen workflow. Our food truck, called Campus Cravings, launched 6 months ago and was immediately more successful than either of us had dared to hope. We'd positioned ourselves near the university campus and several office complexes, serving elevated comfort food that appealed to both students and working professionals. Our Korean fusion tacos and gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches became local favorites, and we were consistently selling out by mid-afternoon most days. By month 3, we were making around $3,000 in profit each week, which was incredible for a new food truck operation. Tom would handle all the financial reporting and banking, giving me weekly updates on our revenue and expenses. According to his reports, we were not only covering our operating costs, but building a healthy reserve fund that would allow us to expand to a second truck within the next year. I was handling all the day-to-day operations, managing our small staff, maintaining relationships with our regular customers, and constantly refining our menu based on customer feedback. Tom would help during our busiest lunch rushes, but his primary focus was on the business management side, handling vendor relationships, tracking our finances, and planning our expansion strategy. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Our customer base was growing steadily, our online reviews were consistently positive, and Tom's financial reports showed that we were exceeding our initial projections for profitability. We'd started discussing plans for opening a second location and possibly even a brick-and-mortar restaurant if our success continued. About 4 months in, I started noticing some small discrepancies that didn't quite make sense when I compared Tom's reports to what I was seeing in daily operations. Our ingredient costs seemed higher than they should have been based on our sales volume, and there were payments to suppliers that I didn't recognize from our usual vendor list. When I asked Tom about these expenses, he always had reasonable explanations about bulk purchasing or finding better deals with new suppliers. The discrepancies became more frequent and more significant over time. Tom would report expenses for equipment maintenance that I didn't remember scheduling, or payments to consultants for services that seemed unnecessary given our current success. He'd also mention occasional slow days that didn't match my memory of our actual sales, but I assumed he was tracking things I wasn't aware of, or that my perception of our busy periods didn't align with our actual revenue. I started paying closer attention to our daily cash flow and keeping my own informal records of our sales and expenses. My numbers consistently showed higher revenue and lower costs than what Tom was reporting in his weekly summaries. When I brought up these discrepancies, he said his numbers included expenses and deductions that I wasn't accounting for, like taxes, fees, and reserve funds for future equipment purchases. The guy was basically gaslighting me with spreadsheets, and I was too trusting to see it happening. That's when everything unraveled in the most devastating way possible. Last Friday, I went to make our usual weekend deposit, expecting to put about $4,000 from our week's earnings into our business account. When I got to the bank, the teller informed me that our account balance was $12.37. I assumed there had been some kind of mistake or system error, so I asked to speak with a manager who could help me figure out what had happened to our money. The bank manager pulled up our account history and showed me 3 weeks of systematic transfers, with large amounts being moved out of our business account almost daily. The transfers had been made to various personal accounts, all of them requiring Tom's authorization since he was the primary account holder. Over 21 days, he'd transferred out nearly $60,000, leaving just enough in the account to keep it open. I called Tom immediately, expecting him to be as shocked and confused as I was, thinking maybe his identity had been stolen or someone had gained unauthorized access to our account. But his phone went straight to voicemail, and when I tried calling his apartment, his roommate said Tom had moved out 3 days ago without giving any forwarding information. That's when I realized that Tom hadn't been the victim of fraud. He'd been systematically stealing from our business for weeks. All those discrepancies I'd noticed, all those explanations about new suppliers and unexpected expenses, it had all been cover for him gradually draining our account while making it look like legitimate business expenses. I drove to his apartment building and confirmed with the landlord that Tom had broken his lease and moved out earlier in the week. His roommate said Tom had claimed he was relocating for a new job opportunity, but had been vague about where he was going or when he'd be back in touch. None of our mutual friends had heard from him, and his social media accounts had been deactivated. But that wasn't even the worst part. When I met with a lawyer to discuss my options, we discovered that Tom had been much more strategic about this theft than just emptying our business account. He'd also been creating fake invoices and expense reports to justify the money transfers, building a paper trail that made it look like the funds had been used for legitimate business purposes. The lawyer found evidence that Tom had been planning this for at least 2 months, gradually increasing the frequency and size of transfers while creating documentation that would make it difficult to prove the money had been stolen rather than spent on business expenses. He'd even created fake contracts with suppliers and service providers to justify some of the larger transfers. Most devastating of all, we discovered that Tom had been moving money through multiple accounts and had already transferred a significant portion offshore to accounts that would be nearly impossible to recover from. The money that wasn't already gone had been converted to cryptocurrency or moved to international accounts that would require extensive legal proceedings to access. The police took my report and opened an investigation, but they warned me that financial crimes like this are notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the perpetrator has planned ahead and moved assets offshore. They said even if they could prove Tom had stolen the money, recovering it would be a separate challenge that could take years and cost more in legal fees than we'd actually recover. Tom had essentially destroyed 6 months of hard work and success in 3 weeks of systematic theft. Our business account was empty, our working capital was gone, and we had bills coming due for rent, insurance, and supplier payments that we couldn't cover. The food truck itself was still valuable, but without operating capital, I couldn't keep the business running while pursuing legal remedies. I had to shut down Campus Cravings within 2 weeks of discovering the theft. I couldn't afford to keep paying our employees, couldn't stock inventory, and couldn't cover the ongoing expenses of permits and insurance. All the momentum we'd built with customers and the reputation we'd established in the community was lost because I couldn't maintain operations while fighting to recover our stolen funds. The worst part was losing not just the money, but the dream that Tom and I had built together. This wasn't just a business partnership that went bad. It was the destruction of a friendship that had lasted over a decade. Someone I'd trusted with my life savings and my future had systematically betrayed that trust while looking me in the eye and lying about it every single day. The legal battle is still ongoing 2 years later, but we've recovered less than 10% of what Tom stole. Most of the money disappeared into offshore accounts or cryptocurrency wallets that our lawyers can't access. Tom himself has never been located, and there's some evidence that he may have left the country entirely. I'm still rebuilding financially and emotionally from what happened. I lost my life savings, my business, and my trust in people I'd considered family. I've had to move back in with my parents, take a regular job to pay basic expenses, and start over completely in terms of my career and financial goals. The experience taught me that even people you've known for years can be capable of devastating betrayal when enough money is involved. Tom had been planning this theft for months while continuing to act like my friend and business partner, which shows a level of deception and manipulation that I never would have believed him capable of. Looking back, there were probably warning signs I should have paid more attention to, like Tom's insistence on handling all the financial aspects of the business and his reluctance to give me direct access to our accounts. But when you trust someone completely, you don't think to look for signs that they're planning to destroy your life. The betrayal was almost worse than the financial loss because it made me question my judgment about people and my ability to trust anyone with important decisions or significant responsibilities. Tom had been one of my closest friends, and if he could deceive me so completely, how could I ever trust anyone else not to do the same thing? Business betrayal is devastating, but imagine discovering your trusted caregiver has been slowly poisoning your life. I hired Anna 6 months ago when my life was completely falling apart. My divorce was getting messy. I was trying to balance a demanding job with single parenting, and my 4-year-old twins, Emma and Jake, needed more stability and attention than I could provide while juggling court dates and lawyer meetings. Anna came with incredible references from 3 different families, had early childhood education credentials, and seemed like an absolute godsend when I met her for the interview. The kids took to Anna immediately, which was a huge relief because they'd been struggling with all the changes in our family situation. She was patient, creative, and had this natural way of engaging with them that made even difficult transitions like bedtime and meal times seem effortless. Anna would create elaborate games and activities that kept Emma and Jake entertained for hours, and she seemed genuinely invested in their well-being and development. For the first few months, everything was perfect. Anna was reliable, professional, and the kids would get excited every morning when she arrived. She'd help them with educational activities, take them to the park, and even coordinate playdates with other kids in the neighborhood. I felt like I'd finally found someone who could provide the stability and care my children needed during such a difficult time in our lives. Anna was also incredibly helpful during the practical aspects of our daily routine. She'd prepare healthy meals that the kids actually wanted to eat, maintain their schedules, and even help with light housekeeping when she had extra time. Having her support allowed me to focus on my work and legal issues without constantly worrying about whether the kids were being properly cared for. But about 3 months into our arrangement, Emma and Jake started getting sick more frequently than usual. It began with occasional stomach bugs that would last a day or two, making them nauseated and clingy. Then they started complaining of fatigue and general feeling unwell, even when they didn't have obvious symptoms of illness. The pediatrician couldn't find anything specifically wrong during checkups, suggesting it might be stress-related due to the divorce and all the upheaval in their lives. What struck me as odd was that the kids seemed to get sick most often on weekdays when Anna was caring for them, but they'd usually feel better by the weekends when I was home with them full time. When I mentioned this pattern to Anna, she suggested that maybe they were picking up bugs from other kids during their weekday activities, and that they felt more secure and relaxed when I was around, which helped their immune systems recover. The kids also started developing some concerning eating habits during this time. They'd refuse to eat meals that I prepared, claiming they didn't taste right or that they weren't hungry, but they'd eagerly eat anything Anna made for them, even foods they'd previously disliked. Anna explained that she'd been working with them on trying new things and that children often ate better for caregivers than for parents because there was less emotional baggage around mealtimes. Anna became incredibly attentive during the kids' sick days, often offering to stay late or come in on weekends to help care for them when they weren't feeling well. She'd bring special soups and teas that she said would help settle their stomachs, and she had endless patience for their clinginess and need for comfort when they were feeling unwell. I was grateful for her dedication, especially since managing sick kids while dealing with divorce proceedings was overwhelming. The frequency of their illnesses started to concern me more as time went on. Emma and Jake were missing preschool regularly, and their energy levels seemed consistently lower than what I remembered from before Anna started working for us. They'd also become unusually dependent on her, asking for Anna when they felt sick and seeming to prefer her comfort over mine during difficult moments. When I mentioned my concerns to the pediatrician again, she suggested that we might want to consider whether the stress of the divorce was manifesting in physical symptoms, and that the kids might be associating feeling better with Anna's presence because she represented stability during a chaotic time. The explanation made sense, but something still felt off about the whole situation. The turning point came when I noticed that the kids seemed to get sick specifically after drinking the morning smoothies that Anna would prepare for them. She'd make these elaborate fruit and vegetable blends that were supposed to boost their immune systems and provide sustained energy throughout the day. But more often than not, they'd complain of stomach aches within an hour of drinking them. This woman basically turned breakfast into chemical warfare, and I had no idea it was happening right under my nose. When I suggested that maybe we should stop the smoothies to see if that helped with their stomach issues, Anna became unusually defensive. She insisted that the smoothies were essential for their nutrition and that stopping them might make their health problems worse. She cited various articles about childhood nutrition and convinced me that consistency was important for building healthy eating habits. But that wasn't even the worst part. I decided to install a discreet camera in the kitchen, not because I suspected Anna of anything sinister, but because I wanted to understand what was happening during their morning routine that might be contributing to their frequent illnesses. I thought maybe I'd catch them eating something they shouldn't, or identify some pattern that would explain their symptoms. What I saw on the footage made me feel physically sick. Anna was adding small amounts of what looked like a clear liquid to their morning juice, stirring it carefully, and then serving it to Emma and Jake with their usual cheerful demeanor. She'd watch them drink it, and then within about an hour, they'd start complaining of feeling nauseated and wanting to lie down. I researched what the liquid might be and discovered that Anna had been dosing my children with ipecac syrup, a substance that's specifically designed to induce nausea and vomiting. She was giving them just enough to make them feel sick and clingy, but not enough to cause obvious poisoning symptoms that would immediately alert medical professionals. The realization that someone I'd trusted completely had been systematically poisoning my children for months was devastating beyond anything I could have imagined. Anna had been creating their illnesses deliberately, making them dependent on her care and comfort, while positioning herself as the solution to problems she was creating. She'd been playing the role of devoted caregiver while secretly harming the children she was supposed to protect. Looking back at the pattern, I realized that Anna had been gradually increasing their dependency on her by making them sick and then providing the care and comfort they needed to feel better. She'd created a situation where the kids associated feeling well with her presence, making herself seem indispensable to their well-being while actually being the source of their suffering. And here's where it gets absolutely terrifying. When I reviewed more of the camera footage, I discovered that Anna had been documenting the kids' symptoms and her responses to them, taking photos and videos of them when they were feeling sick and when they were recovering under her care. She'd been building a portfolio of her caregiver skills, probably to use as references for future jobs, using my poisoned children as props for her resume. She'd also been researching the effects of various substances on children, and I found evidence that she'd been experimenting with different dosages and timing to achieve the exact level of sickness that would make the kids clingy and dependent without causing symptoms severe enough to require hospitalization. I called the police immediately and had Emma and Jake tested for toxins at the emergency room. The tests confirmed the presence of ipecac in their systems, and the doctors were horrified when I explained what had been happening. They said that prolonged exposure to even small amounts of ipecac could have caused serious damage to their digestive systems and overall health. Anna was arrested at her apartment that same day and charged with multiple counts of child endangerment and poisoning. When police searched her belongings, they found notebooks detailing her methods, photos of my children in various stages of illness, and supplies for continuing her poisoning routine. She'd been treating my kids like test subjects in some twisted experiment. During the investigation, police discovered that Anna had a history of similar behavior with previous families, though none of them had realized what was happening at the time. Several former employers reported that children under Anna's care had experienced unexplained illnesses that resolved after she stopped working for them, but they'd attributed it to coincidence rather than deliberate poisoning. The kids recovered completely within a week of Anna's removal from our home. Their energy levels returned to normal, their appetites improved, and they stopped having the mysterious stomach problems that had been plaguing them for months. Watching them return to their healthy, happy selves was both a relief and a heartbreaking reminder of how much they'd suffered under Anna's care. The psychological impact was harder to address. Emma and Jake had trusted Anna completely, and learning that someone they loved had been hurting them was confusing and traumatic. We worked with a child psychologist to help them understand what had happened in age-appropriate terms and to rebuild their sense of safety and trust. Anna pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to several years in prison. But the damage to our family's sense of security was permanent. I developed severe trust issues around childcare and found it almost impossible to leave the kids with anyone else, even qualified professionals with impeccable references. The experience taught me that monsters don't always look like monsters, and that the people who seem most caring and dedicated can sometimes be the most dangerous. Anna had used her knowledge of child development and her understanding of family dynamics to create a situation where she seemed indispensable while actually causing tremendous harm. I still struggle with guilt over not recognizing what was happening sooner. As their mother, I should have been more suspicious when they kept getting sick, and I should have trusted my instincts when something felt off about their symptoms. But Anna was so skilled at manipulation and had such convincing explanations for everything that it was easy to dismiss my concerns. The legal case revealed that Anna had been planning this type of manipulation from the beginning, targeting families going through difficult transitions where parents might be distracted and children might be more vulnerable to developing unhealthy attachments. She'd specifically sought out single parents and families dealing with divorce or other stresses because those situations created the perfect conditions for her scheme. Looking back, there were probably warning signs I missed because I was so grateful to have help and so overwhelmed with everything else going on in my life. Anna's excessive dedication, her defensive responses when I questioned certain patterns, and the kids' unusual attachment to her should have raised more red flags than they did. The whole experience fundamentally changed how I approach childcare and trust. I now understand that background checks and references, while important, can't protect against someone who's skilled at manipulation and deception. The people who seem most helpful and caring can sometimes have the most dangerous motivations. Child endangerment is horrific, but sometimes danger comes from the most unexpected sources. Mrs. Chen was exactly what you'd picture when you imagine the perfect elderly neighbor. At 78 years old, she was this tiny, sweet woman who spent most of her time tending to what appeared to be the most beautiful garden in our entire neighborhood. She'd been living in the house next to mine for over 20 years, long before I moved in, and everyone on the block absolutely adored her. She was always bringing fresh-baked cookies to new neighbors, helping with yard work, and offering gardening advice to anyone who'd listen. Her garden was legitimately spectacular, with these lush, perfectly maintained raised beds full of vegetables, herbs, and flowers that bloomed in coordinated waves throughout the growing season. Mrs. Chen would spend hours out there every day, carefully watering, pruning, and talking to her plants like they were old friends. She had this incredible greenhouse that she'd built herself about 10 years ago, and she was always experimenting with new varieties of tomatoes, peppers, and exotic herbs that she'd order from specialty catalogs. The woman was a gardening legend in our neighborhood. People would walk by just to admire her setup, and she was always happy to share produce with anyone who complimented her work. She'd bring baskets of perfect vegetables to the annual block party, and her homemade salsa was so popular that people would ask her for the recipe constantly. Mrs. Chen would just smile and say the secret was in the special herbs she grew herself. What I initially thought was just Mrs. Chen being popular and social was the steady stream of visitors she'd have throughout the week. People of all ages would stop by to chat with her, often staying for just a few minutes before leaving with small bags or containers that I assumed were filled with vegetables or baked goods. She was clearly generous with her harvest, and I thought it was sweet that she had so many friends and neighbors who appreciated her gardening skills. The visits happened at all hours too, which I attributed to Mrs. Chen being retired and available whenever people needed gardening advice or wanted to pick up produce. I'd see cars pull into her driveway early in the morning before work, during lunch breaks, and late in the evening. Sometimes people would just walk up to her back gate and knock, and she'd come out of the greenhouse to chat with them briefly before they left, looking satisfied with whatever she'd given them. Mrs. Chen's visitors were an interesting mix of people too. College students, young professionals, middle-aged suburban parents, even some elderly folks from other neighborhoods would make regular pilgrimages to her garden. I thought she must have built quite a reputation as the local plant lady, probably trading seeds and cuttings with gardening enthusiasts from all over the city. The only thing that struck me as slightly odd was how quickly most of these visits were. People would arrive, spend maybe 5 minutes with Mrs. Chen, and then leave with their small packages. It seemed efficient for garden-related transactions, but I'd expected people getting gardening advice to stick around longer and actually look at her setup. Most visitors barely glanced at the impressive flower beds and vegetable gardens that were clearly the pride of her property. About 6 months ago, I started noticing that some of Mrs. Chen's visitors were driving pretty expensive cars for people who were just picking up vegetables. Mercedes, BMWs, and luxury SUVs would pull into her driveway multiple times per week, and well-dressed people would emerge for these brief exchanges before driving away. I figured maybe she'd developed a clientele of wealthy foodies who appreciated high-quality, homegrown produce and were willing to pay premium prices for her vegetables. This is the kind of thing where you realize you've been missing the most obvious explanation the entire time. Then came the breaking point when I started paying closer attention to Mrs. Chen's actual plants, particularly the ones in her greenhouse that she was so protective of. She'd always grown what she called her special tomatoes in there, varieties that she claimed were too delicate for outdoor cultivation. But when I caught glimpses of these plants through the greenhouse windows, they looked nothing like any tomato plants I'd ever seen. The leaves were the wrong shape, the growth pattern was completely different, and I never saw any actual tomatoes growing despite the plants being clearly mature and healthy. Mrs. Chen would deflect questions about her greenhouse tomatoes, saying they were experimental varieties that might not produce fruit, and that she was still perfecting her cultivation techniques. Her defensive attitude about the greenhouse started to make more sense when I realized that she'd positioned it in the one corner of her yard that wasn't visible from any neighboring windows, and she'd planted tall hedges around it that blocked the view from the street. For someone who was usually eager to show off her gardening achievements, Mrs. Chen was surprisingly secretive about her greenhouse operation. The truth came out in the most unexpected way during our annual neighborhood barbecue last summer. Mrs. Chen had volunteered to host it in her backyard, which everyone was excited about because we'd finally get a proper tour of her famous garden. She'd set up tables near her vegetable beds and was giving guided tours of her outdoor growing areas, explaining her composting system and sharing tips about soil preparation. I was looking for the bathroom and Mrs. Chen had mentioned I could use the one in her house, but I got turned around and accidentally opened the door to her greenhouse instead of the back door to her kitchen. What I saw inside made me stop dead in my tracks and just stare for a solid 30 seconds while my brain tried to process what I was looking at. The greenhouse was filled with dozens of marijuana plants in various stages of growth, all carefully labeled and organized in a sophisticated hydroponic system that probably cost more than my car. There were grow lights, ventilation systems, nutrient pumps, and monitoring equipment that looked like something from a professional agricultural operation. This wasn't some casual hobby growing. This was a full-scale cannabis cultivation facility disguised as a quaint grandmother's greenhouse. Mrs. Chen appeared behind me about 10 seconds later, and instead of looking panicked or angry about being discovered, she just smiled and asked if I'd like some tea while we talked. She calmly closed the greenhouse door behind us and led me to her kitchen like nothing unusual had happened, chatting about the barbecue and how nice it was to have the whole neighborhood together. But that wasn't even the worst part. Over tea and homemade cookies, Mrs. Chen explained that she'd been running this operation for almost 8 years, ever since her husband died, and she realized that Social Security and her small pension weren't going to be enough to maintain her lifestyle and cover her increasing medical expenses. She'd researched marijuana cultivation online, started with a small setup, and gradually expanded as she learned more about the business and built a steady customer base. Mrs. Chen described her operation with the same pride and attention to detail that she brought to her legitimate gardening. She'd studied different strains, perfected her growing techniques, and developed relationships with suppliers for specialized equipment. She knew the THC content of her different varieties, understood the legal risk she was taking, and had carefully calculated the profits needed to supplement her retirement income. Her customer base was primarily medical marijuana users who couldn't access legal dispensaries due to state laws, along with some recreational users who appreciated the quality and discretion of her operation. Mrs. Chen screened her customers carefully, refused to sell to anyone under 25, and had strict rules about not bringing drama or attention to her neighborhood business. The woman had basically built a boutique cannabis enterprise with better customer service and quality control than most legitimate businesses I'd encountered. She kept detailed records, maintained consistent pricing, and even offered different payment plans for customers dealing with chronic medical conditions who couldn't afford to pay full price up front. Mrs. Chen also explained that she'd been gradually preparing for retirement from her retirement business, saving money to eventually move to a state where marijuana cultivation was legal and she could operate openly. She'd been researching different locations and business models, planning to transition from underground cultivation to legitimate dispensary ownership within the next few years. The conversation was completely surreal, sitting in this sweet old lady's kitchen surrounded by cross-stitch wall hangings and photos of grandchildren, while she explained the economics of illegal drug cultivation with the same enthusiasm she'd previously shown for her tomato varieties. She offered to give me a proper tour of her setup and explain her growing techniques like she was inviting me to see her prize-winning roses. I had to make a decision about what to do with this information, and honestly, it wasn't as clear-cut as you might expect. Mrs. Chen wasn't hurting anyone, she wasn't selling to kids, and she'd been the most considerate and discreet neighbor I'd ever had. Her operation was sophisticated and professional, and she was clearly providing a service that her customers valued and appreciated. What really sealed the deal for me was when Mrs. Chen mentioned that several of her regular customers were elderly people dealing with chronic pain, cancer treatments, and other medical conditions that marijuana helped manage. She said she'd researched the therapeutic benefits extensively and felt like she was providing genuine relief to people who couldn't access legal alternatives. I decided not to report Mrs. Chen's operation to the authorities. She'd been a wonderful neighbor for years, she was running her business responsibly, and frankly, I respected the entrepreneurial spirit of a 78-year-old woman who'd built a successful enterprise to solve her own financial problems. Mrs. Chen moved to Colorado about 6 months later, just like she'd been planning. She sold her house to a nice young family and left me with detailed care instructions for the legitimate parts of her garden that the new owners wanted to maintain. She sends postcards occasionally from her new legal dispensary business, and apparently she's thriving in an environment where her skills are appreciated and her business model is completely above board. The whole experience taught me that people can surprise you in the most unexpected ways, and that sometimes illegal doesn't necessarily mean harmful or immoral. Mrs. Chen had found a creative solution to a real problem, executed it professionally and safely, and transitioned to legitimacy as soon as the opportunity became available. Looking back, all the signs were there if I'd been paying attention, but my assumptions about sweet elderly ladies and their gardening hobbies prevented me from seeing what was actually happening. Mrs. Chen had been hiding in plain sight, using everyone's stereotypes and expectations to run a successful business right under our noses. I still miss having her as a neighbor, not just because she was kind and helpful, but because I genuinely respected her business acumen and problem-solving skills. The woman had built something impressive and managed it with more professionalism than most legitimate businesses, all while maintaining her cover as the neighborhood's beloved plant lady. Sometimes illegal activities are surprisingly wholesome, but other discoveries can shatter your entire worldview. I started seeing Dr. Williams 6 months after my divorce was finalized, when I finally accepted that I needed professional help to process everything Richard had put me through during our marriage and the subsequent legal battle. The divorce had been brutal, with Richard's emotional manipulation and serial infidelity coming to light in ways that made me question my judgment about everything. I was struggling with trust issues, self-doubt, and this overwhelming sense that I'd wasted 5 years of my life with someone who'd been systematically lying to me. Dr. Williams came highly recommended from my primary care physician, and she specialized in helping people recover from toxic relationships and rebuild their sense of self-worth. Her office was in this calming building near downtown, decorated with soft colors and plants that immediately made me feel more at ease. During our first session, she was incredibly empathetic and seemed to really understand the specific type of psychological damage that comes from being married to someone who's manipulative and unfaithful. Our sessions became a lifeline for me during those early months of trying to rebuild my life. Dr. Williams was an excellent listener, and she had this way of helping me recognize patterns in Richard's behavior that I'd been too close to see during the marriage. She helped me understand how emotional manipulation works, why I'd ignored red flags, and how to trust my instincts again after years of being gaslit about my own perceptions and feelings. I spent hours in her office dissecting every aspect of my relationship with Richard, from the early warning signs I'd missed to the specific tactics he'd used to make me doubt myself. Dr. Williams was incredibly insightful about narcissistic behavior patterns and helped me see that Richard's actions weren't about my inadequacies, but about his own psychological issues and need for control. She validated my experiences in ways that helped me stop blaming myself for his choices. Dr. Williams seemed genuinely invested in my healing process, often remembering details from previous sessions and checking in about specific challenges I'd mentioned. She'd ask thoughtful follow-up questions about my progress with dating again, my relationships with friends and family, and my career goals now that I was free from Richard's constant criticism and undermining. I felt like she really cared about my well-being and wanted to see me succeed. The therapeutic relationship felt professional but warm, and I trusted Dr. Williams completely with my most vulnerable thoughts and feelings. She'd helped me work through the shame and embarrassment of staying with Richard as long as I did, and she was instrumental in helping me develop healthier boundaries and recognize manipulative behavior in future relationships. After 6 months of weekly sessions, I was finally starting to feel like myself again. That's why seeing her at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, holding hands with a man across a candlelit table was so jarring. At first I thought maybe I was mistaken about who it was, or that maybe she was having a professional dinner that just looked intimate from a distance. But as I got closer to my own table, I could see that this was clearly a romantic date, not a business meeting or casual dinner with a friend. The man looked familiar, but I couldn't immediately place him because seeing him in this context was so unexpected and surreal. It wasn't until he turned his head slightly and I saw his profile that I realized I was looking at Richard, my ex-husband, having what was obviously a romantic dinner with my therapist. They were leaning close together, sharing food and touching each other's hands in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. This was the same man whose psychological manipulation and emotional abuse I'd been processing in therapy for months, sitting across from the woman who'd been helping me understand why his behavior was so damaging. Dr. Williams knew every detail of Richard's infidelity, his gaslighting tactics, his pattern of making me feel crazy for questioning his obvious lies, and here she was, dating him like none of that information meant anything. The betrayal was so surreal that I sat through my entire dinner in a daze, barely able to process what I'd witnessed. My therapist, who'd spent months validating my experiences and helping me recognize Richard's toxic behavior patterns, was romantically involved with the person who'd caused all the trauma we'd been working to heal. It felt like discovering that your doctor was secretly friends with the person who'd poisoned you. The level of professional and personal violation is honestly hard to put into words. I spent the next week obsessing over what I'd seen, wondering if maybe I'd misinterpreted the situation, or if there was some explanation that would make it less awful than it appeared. But the more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that Dr. Williams had been dating Richard while listening to me describe his abusive behavior in detail during our sessions. She'd been getting both sides of the story and had chosen to pursue a relationship with him anyway. The most disturbing part was realizing that Dr. Williams had been learning intimate details about Richard's psychological patterns and manipulation tactics directly from me. Information that she could use to either help him become more effective at manipulating people or to protect herself from his behavior. Either way, she'd been gaining insights into his personality and methods through my therapy sessions while secretly involved with him romantically. Then came the breaking point when I decided to take photos the next time I saw them together, just to have evidence that I wasn't losing my mind or imagining the whole thing. I followed them discreetly to 2 more dinner dates over the following weeks, documenting their obvious romantic relationship with pictures that clearly showed them being intimate and affectionate in public. The photos were devastating to look at because they confirmed that this wasn't some recent development or chance encounter. Based on their comfort level and body language, Dr. Williams and Richard had clearly been involved for a significant amount of time, probably overlapping with most of my therapy sessions. She'd been professionally counseling me about his psychological abuse, while personally dating him and presumably enjoying his company. I also realized that some of Dr. Williams' insights about Richard's behavior had seemed unusually specific and detailed, like she had more information about his personality than just what I'd shared in our sessions. At the time, I'd attributed her understanding to professional expertise, but looking back, it seemed more likely that she'd been learning about Richard through direct personal experience, while pretending that her knowledge came from clinical training. When I confronted Dr. Williams during our next scheduled session, I laid the photos out on the coffee table between us and asked her to explain what I was looking at. Her initial reaction was complete denial, claiming that the man in the photos wasn't who I thought it was and that I must be mistaken about what I'd seen. She suggested that the stress of the divorce might be causing me to see connections that didn't exist. But when I pointed out specific details that clearly identified Richard, including the distinctive watch I'd bought him for our anniversary and the scar on his hand from a childhood accident, Dr. Williams couldn't maintain her denial. She admitted that she'd been dating Richard for about 3 months, but tried to frame it as something that had happened after she'd gained a better understanding of his personality through our sessions. Her explanation was absolutely unhinged. Dr. Williams claimed that hearing my perspective on Richard's behavior had given her unique insights into his psychological patterns, and that she believed she could help him change and become a better person. She said that many of his problems stemmed from feeling misunderstood, and that having someone who truly comprehended his complexity might be exactly what he needed to grow and heal. She actually tried to convince me that her relationship with Richard was therapeutic for him, and that her professional expertise made her uniquely qualified to handle his manipulative tendencies. Dr. Williams said she could see past his defensive behaviors to the wounded person underneath, and that their relationship was helping him develop healthier communication patterns and emotional regulation skills. The conversation became increasingly surreal as Dr. Williams tried to justify what she'd done by essentially arguing that she was better equipped to handle Richard than I had been. She suggested that my responses to his behavior had enabled his worst tendencies, while her professional training allowed her to set appropriate boundaries and help him grow. It was like she was blaming me for not being skilled enough to fix my own abusive ex-husband, and suddenly the whole plan fell apart when Dr. Williams realized she'd just admitted to multiple serious ethical violations while trying to defend her actions. Dating a client's ex-spouse, using confidential therapy information for personal purposes, and maintaining a romantic relationship that created massive conflicts of interest were all grounds for losing her license to practice therapy. I reported Dr. Williams to the state licensing board that same day, providing them with the photos, detailed documentation of our therapy timeline, and a written account of her admission during our confrontation. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was so clear-cut, and Dr. Williams lost her license within 2 months of my complaint being filed. The licensing board took the case seriously because it involved such egregious violations of professional boundaries and client confidentiality. Dr. Williams had essentially used information gained through therapy sessions to pursue a personal relationship with someone who'd been the subject of those sessions. The board found that she'd violated multiple ethical standards and posed a risk to future clients if allowed to continue practicing. The most satisfying part of the whole situation was that Richard's relationship with Dr. Williams imploded almost immediately after she lost her license. Apparently, Dr. Williams discovered that Richard had been lying to her about various aspects of his life and personality, just like he'd lied to me throughout our marriage. All her professional insights and supposed understanding of his psychology hadn't protected her from being manipulated the same way I had been. Richard tried to contact me after his relationship with Dr. Williams ended, probably hoping to reconcile or at least get sympathy for being involved with someone who'd lost her career. I never responded to any of his attempts to communicate, but I heard through mutual friends that he was struggling with the fact that even a trained professional hadn't been able to maintain a relationship with him once she experienced his behavior firsthand. Finding a new therapist was challenging because the experience with Dr. Williams had damaged my trust in the entire profession. I eventually found someone who specialized in helping people recover from professional boundary violations, and working with her helped me process not just the original trauma from my marriage, but also the additional betrayal of having my therapeutic relationship corrupted by someone who was supposed to help me heal. The new therapist helped me understand that Dr. Williams' behavior was an extreme violation that didn't reflect the standards of ethical mental health professionals. She also helped me work through the complex feelings of having my personal information and vulnerabilities used against me in such a calculated way. The experience taught me to be more cautious about professional relationships and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. Looking back, I should have reported the obvious conflict of interest immediately, instead of trying to convince myself that I might have been mistaken about what I'd seen. Dr. Williams had violated every principle of ethical therapy practice, and her justifications for her behavior showed a complete lack of understanding about professional boundaries and client welfare. The whole experience was ultimately valuable because it taught me that recovery from betrayal requires rebuilding trust gradually and carefully, even with professionals who are supposed to help. It also showed me that my instincts about Richard's character had been correct all along, since even someone with professional training couldn't maintain a relationship with him once she experienced his manipulation tactics directly. Professional boundary violations are shocking, but sometimes the people we trust most are hiding the darkest secrets. Finding an apartment in the city that was both beautiful and affordable felt like winning the lottery. So when Mr. Peterson offered me the one-bedroom unit in his converted Victorian house for $800 below market rate, I jumped at the opportunity. The place was gorgeous, with original hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, and huge windows that let in amazing natural light. Mr. Peterson seemed like the ideal landlord too, friendly and professional during our initial meeting, with great references from previous tenants who described him as responsive and fair. Mr. Peterson was probably in his early 60s, well-dressed and articulate, and he clearly took pride in maintaining his properties. During the apartment tour, he pointed out all the recent updates he'd made, from the renovated kitchen to the modern security system he'd installed throughout the building. He explained that he lived in the unit upstairs and that having an owner on site meant any maintenance issues would be addressed quickly and efficiently. For the first few months, everything was exactly as advertised. Mr. Peterson was incredibly responsive to any requests, often fixing minor issues the same day I reported them. He'd check in periodically to make sure everything was working properly and that I was comfortable with the apartment. The building felt secure, the rent was reasonable, and I thought I'd found the perfect living situation in an expensive city where good apartments were hard to come by. Mr. Peterson seemed genuinely invested in making sure his tenants were happy and comfortable. He'd remember details about my work schedule and would time maintenance visits for when it was most convenient for me. When my bathroom faucet started dripping, he had it fixed within 2 hours. When I mentioned that the living room got chilly in the evenings, he installed additional weather stripping around the windows that same weekend. What I initially appreciated as attentive property management started to feel slightly intrusive after about 4 months of living there. Mr. Peterson would mention things about my daily routine that seemed oddly specific for someone who just happened to live upstairs. He'd comment on how late I'd been getting home from work, or ask about weekend visitors I'd had, or reference conversations I'd had on phone calls that I thought had been private. When I asked him how he knew so much about my comings and goings, Mr. Peterson would explain that the old house had thin walls and that sound carried more than I probably realized. He said he wasn't intentionally listening to my activities, but that he couldn't help overhearing things when he was working in his own apartment. His explanations always sounded reasonable, and I felt awkward for even questioning his awareness of my schedule and activities. The feeling of being watched in my own home started gradually and was easy to dismiss as paranoia or stress from work. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder while watching TV, or feeling uncomfortable changing clothes, even with the curtains closed. I told myself I was just adjusting to living alone in a new place, and that the feeling would fade as I got more comfortable with my surroundings. But the sensation of being observed became more persistent and specific over time. I'd feel watched most intensely in my bedroom and bathroom, spaces where privacy should have been absolute. I started closing doors that I'd normally leave open and becoming more conscious of my movements around the apartment. The feeling was strong enough that I began changing my routines, like getting dressed in my closet instead of my bedroom, just to feel more secure. I also started noticing tiny details around the apartment that seemed different from when I'd first moved in. There were small holes in the walls that I didn't remember seeing during the initial tour, usually near the ceiling or in corners where they'd be easy to overlook. When I asked Mr. Peterson about them, he said they were probably from previous tenants hanging pictures or installing shelves, and offered to patch them if they bothered me. The way he's explaining away every single thing I notice is starting to feel rehearsed. That's when everything unraveled during what should have been a routine maintenance visit. Mr. Peterson had come to check the smoke detectors, something he said he did quarterly for insurance purposes. I was working from home that day and had stepped out to take a phone call in the hallway when I heard him moving around in my bedroom. When I came back inside, I caught him adjusting something inside the smoke detector above my bed. When I asked what he was doing, Mr. Peterson said he was just replacing the battery, but something about his demeanor seemed off. He was more nervous than usual and seemed eager to finish quickly and leave. After he left, I decided to take a closer look at the smoke detector myself, using a chair to get high enough to examine it properly. What I found inside made my blood run cold. There was a tiny camera lens built into the smoke detector, so small that you'd never notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. The device looked professional and expensive, clearly designed to be hidden and record without detection. I immediately started checking other smoke detectors throughout the apartment and found cameras in every single one. But that wasn't even the worst part. Once I knew what to look for, I found cameras everywhere. Behind picture frames that Mr. Peterson had hung when I moved in, inside air vents in both the bathroom and bedroom, and even built into what I'd thought were decorative elements like outlet covers and light fixtures. The apartment was completely wired for surveillance, with multiple angles covering every room, including the most private spaces. The realization that I'd been unknowingly recorded in my own home for months was devastating beyond anything I could have imagined. Every private moment, every phone call, every intimate detail of my daily life had been captured and stored by someone I'd trusted and paid rent to. I felt violated in a way that made me physically sick, knowing that Mr. Peterson had been watching me shower, sleep, change clothes, and live my life without any awareness that I was being observed. I confronted Mr. Peterson immediately, calling him and demanding that he come downstairs to explain the cameras I'd discovered. When he arrived, I showed him the devices I'd found and asked him to explain why my apartment was under surveillance. His initial response was to deny that the cameras were functional, claiming they were old security equipment from previous tenants that he'd forgotten to remove. When I pointed out that the cameras were clearly new and actively recording, Mr. Peterson's story changed. He admitted that he'd installed them but claimed it was for security purposes, to protect his property and ensure that tenants weren't damaging the apartment or engaging in illegal activities. He said he was within his rights as a property owner to monitor his own building. I told him that recording tenants without consent was illegal regardless of his property rights, and that cameras in bathrooms and bedrooms were never acceptable under any circumstances. That's when Mr. Peterson broke down and admitted that he'd been watching the footage regularly and had recordings of everything that had happened in my apartment since I'd moved in. Things went from bad to unhinged when Mr. Peterson tried to justify his behavior by saying that he'd never intended to violate my privacy, but that watching the recordings had become compulsive and he couldn't stop himself. He said he'd been doing this for years with female tenants and that he'd convinced himself it wasn't really harmful since he wasn't sharing the footage or using it to threaten anyone. The conversation became increasingly disturbing as Mr. Peterson revealed the extent of his surveillance operation. He had recordings stored on multiple hard drives, organized by tenant and date, going back several years. He'd been systematically recording women in their most private moments, and apparently saw nothing wrong with it as long as he kept the footage to himself. I called the police immediately while Mr. Peterson was still in my apartment, refusing to let him leave until they arrived. When the officers showed up, they were horrified by what they found and arrested Mr. Peterson on the spot. The investigation revealed that he'd been running this surveillance operation for over 5 years, targeting young women who lived alone and couldn't afford market-rate apartments. The police found thousands of hours of recordings, sophisticated equipment for storing and organizing the footage, and evidence that Mr. Peterson had been researching his tenants' personal information to select victims who were unlikely to cause problems if they discovered the cameras. He'd been preying on women who needed affordable housing and were grateful for his seemingly generous rental rates. I moved out within 48 hours of discovering the cameras, staying with friends while I found a new apartment and tried to process what had happened. The police kept my apartment as a crime scene while they gathered evidence, which meant I couldn't retrieve most of my belongings for several weeks. Even when I did get my things back, I threw away anything that might have been contaminated by Mr. Peterson's surveillance. Mr. Peterson was charged with multiple felonies, including invasion of privacy, illegal surveillance, and sexual exploitation. The investigation revealed that he'd been doing this to female tenants for years, and several other women came forward with similar stories once news of his arrest became public. Many of them had experienced the same feelings of being watched but had dismissed their instincts or been convinced by Mr. Peterson's explanations. The legal case is still ongoing, but Mr. Peterson has already pleaded guilty to most of the charges and will likely spend several years in prison. I'm pursuing a civil lawsuit to recover damages for the emotional trauma and violation of privacy, but no amount of money can undo the knowledge that someone was watching and recording my most private moments for months. The experience has permanently changed how I think about privacy and security in rental properties. I now inspect every apartment thoroughly for hidden cameras before signing a lease, and I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong about a living situation. The feeling of being watched that I'd dismissed as paranoia had been completely accurate. I'll probably never feel completely safe in a rental apartment again, knowing how easy it is for landlords to install surveillance equipment and how difficult it can be to detect. The betrayal of trust was devastating because Mr. Peterson had seemed like such a kind, professional landlord who genuinely cared about his tenants' comfort and safety. Looking back, there were warning signs I should have paid more attention to, like his extensive knowledge of my schedule and his insistence on having access to the apartment for frequent maintenance visits. But when someone appears helpful and trustworthy, it's natural to give them the benefit of the doubt rather than assuming they're capable of such a serious violation. The whole experience taught me that predators can be incredibly skilled at appearing normal and trustworthy while engaging in behavior that's deeply disturbing and illegal. Mr. Peterson had built his entire rental business around finding vulnerable tenants he could exploit, and he'd been getting away with it for years because his victims either didn't notice the surveillance or didn't trust their own instincts when something felt wrong. Surveillance violations are terrifying, but sometimes the scariest discoveries happen in our own families. I had major knee surgery 3 months ago after tearing my ACL during a hiking accident, and the recovery process required some pretty serious pain medication to manage the discomfort. The orthopedic surgeon prescribed me a bottle of 60 oxycodone pills, explaining that I'd need them for the first few weeks while the worst of the surgical pain subsided. He was very clear about the addictive potential and told me to use them sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. For the first week after surgery, I definitely needed the medication to function at all. The pain was intense, and even with the pills, I was barely able to get around the house or sleep through the night. But by the second week, I was starting to feel better and didn't need to take them as frequently. I'd take one in the morning if I was planning to do physical therapy, and maybe another at night if the pain was keeping me awake. About 3 weeks into my recovery, I started noticing that my pill bottle seemed to be emptying faster than it should have been, based on how often I was actually taking them. At first, I assumed I was just miscounting because the medication made me pretty foggy and disoriented. I'd sometimes forget whether I'd already taken my daily dose, so I figured maybe I was taking more than I realized without keeping proper track. My daughter Emma had been incredibly helpful during my recovery, bringing me meals, helping with household tasks, and generally making sure I had everything I needed while I was mostly confined to the couch. She's 17 and has always been responsible and trustworthy, so when she offered to help organize my medications and remind me when to take them, I was grateful for the assistance. Emma would bring me my pills with water at the scheduled times, and she seemed genuinely concerned about my pain levels and recovery progress. She'd ask how I was feeling, whether the medication was helping, and if there was anything else she could do to make me more comfortable. Having her support during such a difficult time made the whole experience much more manageable. But around the 4th week of my recovery, I noticed that Emma seemed to have more spending money than usual. She came home with new clothes, expensive makeup, and even a new phone case that looked like it cost at least $50. When I asked her where she was getting the money for these purchases, she said she'd gotten a part-time job at a local coffee shop that fit around her school schedule. I was proud that Emma had taken initiative to find work, especially since she'd been so focused on helping me that I hadn't expected her to have time for a job. But when I tried to verify the employment by asking for details about her work schedule or offering to drive her to shifts, her answers were always vague. She'd say her hours were flexible or that she was mostly doing online work for the business. Emma's grades also started slipping around this time, which was unusual because she'd always been an excellent student who took pride in her academic performance. Her teachers started sending emails about missing assignments and declining participation in class discussions. When I asked Emma about it, she said she was just stressed about my injury and having trouble concentrating on schoolwork while worrying about my recovery. The changes in Emma's behavior were gradual enough that I attributed them to the stress of having an injured parent and the additional responsibilities she'd taken on around the house. She seemed more tired than usual, less communicative, and was spending time with kids I didn't recognize from her usual friend group. But I figured these were normal adjustments to our temporary family situation. It's wild how easy it is to miss what's happening right under your nose when you're dealing with your own problems. That's when everything unraveled with a phone call from Emma's school principal that I'll never forget. Mrs. Rodriguez called to inform me that Emma had been caught with prescription medication during a random locker search that the school conducted as part of their drug prevention program. They'd found 3 separate pill bottles in her backpack, all containing controlled substances, and Emma was being suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. The principal explained that the pills appeared to be prescription opioids and that Emma had admitted to selling them to other students for $20 per pill. She'd apparently been running a small operation, buying pills from various sources and reselling them to classmates who were either experimenting with drugs or dealing with their own pain issues from sports injuries. When I got to the school to pick Emma up, the full scope of what she'd been doing became clear. The pills in her possession included several of my oxycodone tablets, which she'd been systematically stealing from my recovery medication. She'd also somehow acquired pills from other sources, possibly other students with access to prescription medications from their own families. Emma broke down crying when confronted with the evidence, admitting that she'd been taking my pills for over 2 weeks and selling them to classmates who'd heard that she had access to pain medication. She said it started when a friend mentioned that prescription opioids were worth a lot of money, and Emma realized she could make easy cash by taking a few of my pills and selling them at school. But that wasn't even the worst part. The investigation revealed that Emma had been taking 2 or 3 pills from my bottle every few days, replacing them with over-the-counter pain relievers that looked similar. That's why I'd felt like my medication wasn't lasting as long as expected, but hadn't immediately realized what was happening. She'd been carefully managing her theft to avoid taking so many that I'd noticed the bottle emptying too quickly. Emma had also been researching the street value of various prescription medications online and had apparently been in contact with other students about acquiring different types of pills to expand her business. The $20 per pill she was charging was actually below market rate, which meant she was building a customer base and potentially planning to increase her operation over time. The school provided me with a list of students who had purchased pills from Emma, and I had to make the devastating decision to contact their parents and inform them about what had happened. These were kids I'd known for years, many of whom I'd driven to soccer practice or had over for sleepovers, and now I had to tell their families that my daughter had been selling them drugs. Most of the parents were understanding and grateful that I'd called them directly rather than letting them find out through school gossip or disciplinary actions. But some were angry and blamed me for not securing my medication properly or monitoring Emma's activities more closely. The conversations were humiliating and heartbreaking, knowing that my family's crisis had potentially put other children at risk. Emma's explanation for why she'd done it was a mix of opportunism and misguided thinking about the seriousness of prescription drug abuse. She said she didn't think it was real drug dealing because the pills were legal medications, and she convinced herself that she was just helping friends who were dealing with pain from sports injuries or stress from school. She also admitted that the money had become addictive in its own way, giving her a sense of independence and power that she'd never experienced before. Emma said she'd started small, just taking 1 or 2 pills to see if anyone would buy them. But when she realized how easy it was to make money, she'd gotten caught up in expanding the operation without thinking about the consequences. Things went from bad to unhinged when I discovered that Emma had been using some of the pills herself, not just selling them. She admitted to taking them occasionally when she was stressed about school or when she wanted to feel more relaxed during social situations. The realization that my daughter was both dealing and using prescription opioids was devastating beyond anything I could have imagined. I immediately got Emma into counseling with a therapist who specialized in adolescent addiction and risky behavior. The therapist explained that prescription drug abuse among teenagers had become increasingly common, partly because kids perceived prescription medications as safer than illegal drugs, not understanding that they could be just as dangerous and addictive. Emma also had to attend addiction education classes and participate in community service related to drug prevention. The legal consequences were minimal because she was a minor and a first-time offender, but the school suspension and the requirement to complete drug counseling meant that her junior year was significantly disrupted. The trust rebuilding process took months and required constant vigilance on my part. I had to lock up all medications in a secure box, monitor Emma's activities and friendships much more closely, and have regular check-ins with her counselor about her progress and risk factors. Emma lost most of her privileges, including her phone, car access, and freedom to spend time with friends unsupervised. The experience taught both of us about the serious risks of prescription drug abuse and how quickly a situation can spiral out of control when teenagers have access to controlled substances. Emma had to write letters of apology to the families affected by her actions, and she participated in school presentations about the dangers of prescription drug trafficking. Our relationship slowly healed as Emma demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to making better choices. She worked hard to bring her grades back up, ended friendships with kids who were involved in drug use, and became an advocate for prescription drug safety among her peers. The experience was ultimately a wake-up call that helped her understand the serious consequences of her actions before she got into more serious legal trouble. Looking back, I should have been more careful about securing my medication from the beginning, but I never imagined that my responsible, trustworthy daughter would steal prescription drugs and sell them at school. The experience taught me that even kids with good judgment can make terrible decisions when they don't fully understand the risks involved or when they're tempted by easy money. The whole situation reinforced how important it is for parents to stay vigilant about changes in their teenagers' behavior and to take prescription drug security seriously, even within their own families. Emma's actions put multiple families at risk and could have had devastating consequences for the kids who bought pills from her. Parental betrayal cuts deep, but sometimes strangers can restore faith in humanity. Losing my wallet during what should have been a routine grocery shopping trip felt like one of those small disasters that somehow manages to ruin your entire week. I'd been running errands all Saturday afternoon, hitting 3 different stores to pick up everything I needed for a dinner party I was hosting that evening. Somewhere between the grocery store, the wine shop, and the florist, my wallet just vanished into thin air. The wallet contained $200 in cash that I'd withdrawn specifically for the weekend's expenses, plus all my credit cards, my driver's license, and most devastatingly, several irreplaceable family photos that I'd been carrying around for years. There was a picture of my grandmother that had been taken just a few months before she passed away, a photo of my parents on their wedding day, and a snapshot of my dog from when he was a puppy that always made me smile during stressful days. I spent over 3 hours retracing my steps, checking with every store I'd visited, looking under car seats, and searching through every bag and receipt from my shopping trip. The grocery store employees were incredibly helpful, checking their lost and found and even reviewing security footage to see if they could spot when I might have dropped it. The wine shop manager personally walked through the entire store with me, looking behind displays and in corners where it might have fallen. But after exhausting every possible location and asking every employee who might have seen it, I had to accept that my wallet was simply gone. I called my credit card companies to cancel everything, went to the DMV website to start the process of replacing my license, and tried to calculate how much cash I'd need to withdraw from the bank to get through the weekend. The money was frustrating to lose, but what really broke my heart was knowing that those family photos were probably sitting in a dumpster somewhere or had been thrown away by whoever found the wallet. Those pictures represented decades of memories and family history that I'd never be able to replace. I kicked myself for not making copies or storing them somewhere safer. I spent the next few days feeling stupid and careless, wondering how I could have been so absent-minded as to lose something so important. Every time I reached for my wallet out of habit, I'd remember that it was gone and feel that sinking sensation all over again. I'd started the process of replacing everything, but it was going to take weeks to get new cards and identification, and the family photos were lost forever. 3 days after losing it, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman with a kind voice said her name was Maria and that she'd found a wallet in a parking lot that belonged to me. She'd gotten my phone number from a business card that was tucked behind my driver's license, and she wanted to return everything to me as soon as possible. I was so relieved that I almost started crying right there on the phone. Maria suggested we meet at a coffee shop near where she'd found the wallet, and I immediately agreed, offering to drive anywhere that was convenient for her. She picked a place that was actually closer to my house than hers, saying she didn't mind the extra drive since she knew how stressful it must be to lose something so important. This is the part where the story takes a turn that still makes me emotional 3 years later. When I met Maria at the coffee shop, she was exactly what you'd picture when you imagine someone genuinely kind and thoughtful. She was probably in her 50s, with this warm smile and gentle demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She handed me my wallet and started apologizing for taking so long to contact me, explaining that she'd been out of town for work and had only just gotten back. I opened the wallet expecting to find my cards and photos, but none of the cash, which would have been completely understandable and fair. Instead, I found everything exactly as I'd left it, plus an additional $50 that definitely hadn't been there before. When I pointed out the extra money, Maria waved off my confusion and said it was for the inconvenience of having to deal with replacing everything and the stress of losing it in the first place. But that wasn't even the most incredible part. Maria had also somehow tracked down gift cards to replace the expired coupons I'd been carrying, including one for the exact grocery store where I'd been shopping when I lost the wallet. She'd noticed the expired coupons when she looked through the wallet to find my contact information, and she'd taken the time to buy new gift cards with similar values to replace what I'd lost. When I tried to refuse the extra money and the gift cards, telling her that just getting my wallet back with the photos intact was more than enough, Maria insisted that I keep everything. She said that several years ago, she'd lost her own wallet during a difficult time in her life when she was struggling financially and emotionally. A stranger had not only returned it, but had added money and a kind note that had restored her faith in people when she needed it most. Maria explained that the person who'd helped her had asked only that she pass along the same kindness to someone else if she ever had the opportunity. She said that finding my wallet felt like the universe giving her a chance to honor that request and continue a chain of kindness that had started with a stranger's generosity toward her years earlier. The conversation revealed that Maria had actually gone to some effort to learn about my situation before contacting me. She'd looked up the business card in my wallet and done some research to make sure I was really the wallet's owner and not someone trying to claim it fraudulently. She'd also noticed from my grocery receipts and coupons that I was probably planning some kind of event, which is why she'd been so eager to return everything quickly. And here's where it gets even more heartwarming. Maria and I ended up talking at that coffee shop for over 2 hours, sharing stories about our lives, our families, and our experiences with both giving and receiving unexpected kindness from strangers. She was fascinating and wise, with this perspective on life that came from someone who'd experienced both difficult times and genuine human generosity. That chance meeting led to a friendship that's now lasted 3 years and has enriched my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Maria and I meet for coffee regularly. We've celebrated holidays together, and she's become like a surrogate aunt to me. She's taught me so much about looking for opportunities to help others and about the ripple effects that small acts of kindness can have on people's lives. The experience completely changed how I think about lost items and found opportunities to help others. I've since returned 2 lost wallets myself, and in both cases I followed Maria's example by adding a little something extra and a note explaining that I was passing along kindness that had been shown to me. One of those people has stayed in touch, and they've told me about similar acts of kindness they've been able to perform as a result. What struck me most about Maria's approach was how thoughtful and intentional she'd been about the whole thing. She hadn't just returned my wallet with a quick phone call and handoff. She'd taken time to consider what I might need, to replace things that couldn't be returned, and to create an experience that would restore my faith in people rather than just solving my immediate problem. The story also taught me about the power of small gestures to create lasting connections between people. If Maria had just returned my wallet and left it at that, I would have been grateful, but we probably never would have spoken again. Instead, her generosity and the conversation it sparked led to a meaningful friendship that has brought joy and wisdom into both our lives. Looking back, losing my wallet was one of the best things that happened to me that year, not because of the inconvenience or stress, but because it led me to Maria and taught me about the kind of person I wanted to be in the world. Her example showed me that returning lost items could be an opportunity for genuine human connection and mutual enrichment, rather than just a brief transaction. The whole experience reinforced my belief that most people are fundamentally good, and that small acts of kindness can have profound impacts on both the giver and receiver. Maria didn't have to go above and beyond in returning my wallet, but her choice to do so created a ripple effect of generosity and connection that's still continuing years later. I still carry those same family photos in my wallet, but now they're accompanied by a small note that Maria wrote me during one of our early coffee meetings. It says, "Pass it forward," and reminds me daily to look for opportunities to show unexpected kindness to others, just like she showed to me during what could have been just a simple wallet return. That beautiful ending reminds us that people can surprise us. Ordering a DNA test kit during the holidays seemed like the perfect gift to give myself and my family. I'd always been curious about our ancestry, and with all the advertising about discovering distant relatives and learning about your heritage, it felt like a fun way to maybe connect with some long-lost cousins or find out if we really had Irish roots like my grandmother always claimed. My parents seemed excited about it too, with my dad joking that he hoped we'd find out we were related to royalty or famous historical figures. The whole process was simple enough. I spit in the tube, mailed it back, and waited the 6 weeks for results while imagining what cool discoveries we might make about our family tree. My mom kept asking if I'd heard anything back yet. And my dad would make jokes about hoping we weren't descended from pirates or criminals. It felt like this fun family project that we were all anticipating together. When the email finally arrived saying my results were ready, I was genuinely excited to log in and start exploring. The ancestry breakdown was interesting enough, showing the mix of European heritage we'd expected. But what really caught my attention was the DNA relatives section. I was matched with dozens of people who shared varying percentages of DNA with me, from distant cousins to closer relatives I'd never heard of. The first thing that struck me as odd was that I didn't recognize a single name from my father's side of the family, despite having several matches who shared significant amounts of DNA with me. My dad has a pretty large extended family with distinctive surnames, and I'd grown up knowing most of my aunts, uncles, and cousins from family gatherings and holidays. But none of those familiar names appeared in my closest DNA matches. Instead, I was seeing names I'd never heard before, people who shared enough DNA with me to be close relatives, but who didn't connect to any family stories or relatives I'd ever met. The percentages were too high for these to be distant cousins from branches of the family tree I didn't know about. These were people who should have been aunts, uncles, or first cousins, but they were complete strangers. I started reaching out to some of these DNA matches through the platform's messaging system, introducing myself and asking if they recognized my name or knew how we might be related. Most of them were just as confused as I was, saying they didn't recognize my last name or know anyone from my dad's family. But they were all connected to each other in ways that suggested they were part of a family group that I somehow belonged to, but had never known existed. The pattern became impossible to ignore when I realized that every single one of my close DNA matches was connected to one particular family name that meant nothing to me. These weren't random distant relatives scattered across different branches of a family tree. They were all part of one specific family that I was apparently closely related to, despite having no knowledge of who they were or how I could possibly be connected to them. Here's where reality starts to feel like it's shifting under your feet. That's when everything unraveled as I started mapping out the relationships between my DNA matches and realized what the genetic evidence was telling me. The people I was most closely related to were all connected to a man named Robert Martinez, who appeared to be the father or grandfather of most of my closest matches. The DNA percentages suggested that Robert and I shared a relationship consistent with him being my grandfather, or possibly my father. The problem was that I'd never heard the name Robert Martinez in my entire life, and my father's name is David Thompson. My dad's father was named William Thompson, and I'd known him until he passed away when I was 12. There was no Robert Martinez anywhere in my family history that I knew of, yet the genetic evidence was overwhelming that I was closely related to his family. I spent hours staring at the family trees that my DNA matches had built, trying to figure out how I could possibly fit into their family structure. The only explanation that made sense was that my biological father wasn't David Thompson, the man who'd raised me and who I'd called Dad for 25 years. According to the DNA evidence, my real father was someone from the Martinez family that I'd never met. The emotional impact of realizing that my entire understanding of my family history might be wrong was devastating. This wasn't just about discovering some interesting ancestry or connecting with distant relatives. This was about learning that the fundamental facts of my identity and parentage were potentially completely different from what I'd believed my entire life. I printed out all the DNA results and family tree information, organizing everything into a folder that clearly showed the genetic connections and what they meant in terms of biological relationships. The evidence was undeniable when laid out systematically. I was not genetically related to the man I'd always known as my father, but I was closely related to a family I'd never heard of. Things went from confusing to life-changing when I finally worked up the courage to confront my mom with the genetic evidence. I showed her the printouts and explained what the DNA percentages meant, asking her if there was anything about my parentage that she needed to tell me. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know before she even said a word. My mum broke down completely, crying in a way I'd never seen before and admitting to something she'd kept secret for 25 years. She told me about a brief affair she'd had with a family friend named Robert Martinez during a rough patch in her marriage to my dad. Robert had moved away for work before I was born, and my mum had convinced herself that my dad was my biological father because she wanted it to be true. The revelation that my mom had been carrying this secret for my entire life was almost harder to process than learning about my biological father. She'd watched me grow up looking increasingly like someone else, had seen me develop personality traits and interests that didn't match either parent, and had never said anything about the possibility that my paternity wasn't what everyone assumed. My mom explained that Robert Martinez had been a close friend of both my parents, someone who'd been part of their social circle for several years before I was conceived. The affair had been brief and had happened during a period when my parents were having serious marital problems and were considering separation. When my mum discovered she was pregnant, she'd ended the affair and reconciled with my dad, deciding to let him believe he was my biological father. The most heartbreaking part was learning that my dad had suspected something over the years, but had chosen not to pursue his doubts because he loved me and didn't want to risk losing me or destroying our family. My mom said there had been conversations between them about my appearance and personality that didn't quite match, but they'd both decided that it didn't matter as long as we were happy as a family. When we told my dad what the DNA test had revealed, his reaction was both devastating and beautiful. He cried when he learned that his suspicions had been correct, but he immediately told me that it didn't change anything about our relationship or how he felt about me. He said I'd always be his daughter regardless of genetics, and that 25 years of loving and raising me meant more than any DNA test could ever prove or disprove. But that wasn't even the most emotional part of this whole discovery. With my mom's help, I was able to locate Robert Martinez, who was now living in Colorado and had never married or had children that he knew of. When I called him and explained who I was and what I'd discovered, there was a long silence before he started crying and said he'd always wondered if I might be his daughter, but had never felt like he could ask or interfere with our family. Robert told me that he'd thought about me constantly over the years, especially on birthdays and holidays, wondering what I looked like and whether I was happy. He'd kept in touch with mutual friends who occasionally mentioned my achievements and milestones, and he'd been proud of me from a distance but had never felt like he had the right to be part of my life. The conversation with Robert was surreal because I could immediately hear similarities in our voices and ways of speaking that I'd never noticed with my dad. He told me about interests and personality traits that we apparently shared, and he sent me photos that showed an undeniable family resemblance that explained features I'd never been able to trace to either of my parents. Meeting Robert in person 6 months later was emotional and wonderful in ways I couldn't have anticipated. He was everything my mum had described, kind and thoughtful, and genuinely excited to finally meet me after wondering about me for so long. We spent hours talking about everything from childhood memories to career goals, and it was amazing to finally understand where some of my interests and abilities had come from. The situation with my family has stabilized into something that works for all of us, though holidays and special occasions require careful coordination. My dad remains my dad in every way that matters, and our relationship has actually grown stronger through the honesty and openness that came from finally addressing the questions that had lingered for years. Robert has become an important part of my life as well, filling a role that's somewhere between father and close friend. My parents stayed married and worked through the issues that the revelation brought up, with counseling helping them process the emotions and trust issues that had been buried for decades. My mum's secret had been eating at her for years, and finally being honest about what had happened allowed them to address problems in their marriage that they'd been avoiding since before I was born. The whole experience taught me that family is much more complicated than genetics, and that love and commitment matter more than DNA when it comes to the relationships that shape who we become. I'm incredibly grateful to have been raised by a man who chose to love me unconditionally, and I'm also grateful to have the opportunity to know my biological father and understand more about where I came from. Looking back, I'm glad I took that DNA test, despite the upheaval it caused. The truth was worth knowing, even though it complicated everything I thought I understood about my family. Having two fathers who both love me and want me in their lives feels like a gift, even though it took 25 years and a genetics kit to make it happen. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, life's strangest stories often write themselves. Whether it's shocking betrayals or surprising kindness, you never know what tomorrow might reveal. Keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and maybe, just maybe, check those security cameras once in a while. Until next time, sleep well, knowing that whatever chaos you're facing, at least it probably isn't as wild as what we've covered tonight.